Almighty God, we give thanks to you, the creator of the universe, and humbly beseech you to direct and prosper the deliberations of the members of this House here assembled for the advancement of your glory and the trust and welfare of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Grant that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be established among us for all generations. Amen.
Oath or affirmation. Announcements by the Deputy Speaker.
Honorable members, I have received communication from Dr. Lakram Bodo, MP, member for Faizabad, who has requested leave of absence from today's sittings of the House. The leave which the member seeks is granted. Honorable members, as you may be aware, Dr. Reza Mohammed, former Member of Parliament, passed away on January 8, 2022. Dr. Mohammed served as the Member of Parliament for Princestown during the 5th Republican Parliament, 1995 to 2000. During the period November 27, 1995 to October 21, 1999, Dr. Mohammed served as Minister of Agriculture, Land and Marine Resources, and during the period October 22, 1999 to December 11, 2000, he served as Minister of the Environment. I will now invite honorable members to pay their respective tributes to Dr. Mohammed. I will call on the member for Aruka Maloney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is without doubt that we are always saddened at the passing of one of our former colleagues. I served in the Parliament, in the House of Representatives with Reza Mohammed during the period that he was in the House of Representatives from 1995 to 2000. And we always had a very cordial relationship. He was what we would call an academic who became a consummate politician, in that he worked assiduously for his constituents to ensure that they got that to which they were entitled. He also made every effort to ensure that in his ministerial portfolio, he achieved those aspects of his portfolio that were entrusted to him and which were in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Versed in French, he continued even after he left active politics to work in the interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, as he served during the period 2016 to 2020 as the president, in fact, to today, if he were alive, as the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Assembly of Hunting associations, and during the period 2018 to 2020, as a member of the Cabinet-appointed Wildlife Conservation Committee. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is no gainsaying that when anyone extends themselves to the point where they serve the public, whether in a representational capacity or any other capacity of public service, we must pay homage to such a person. And today, on behalf of the People's National Movement, on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, we pay homage to Reza Mohammed. We extend our sympathy to his wife Joan and his 4 children, and we ask that his soul will rest in peace and rise in glory. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I will now call on the member for Oropouche East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we'd like also to join the members of the government in extending our deepest condolences to the family and friends and the community of Princestown on the passing of a former Member of Parliament, Dr. Reza Mohammed. Dr. Mohammed served in the 5th Republican Parliament between November 1995 and November 2000, served in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Marine Resources, and later as the Minister of the Environment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I had the distinct pleasure of working and interfacing with Dr. Mohammed while I worked at the Office of the Prime Minister during this period. I later had a great opportunity to work with Dr. Mohammed and to share his views and receive his ideas when I also served as Minister of Housing and the Environment. Dr. Mohammed was a very combative yet gentle soul. He had a great passion for the environment and for the agricultural sector that saw Dr. Mohammed raising very pertinent and at times very novel and radical ideas. In fact, I think a defining feature of his political intervention was the creative ideas and new policy initiatives that he implemented and later spoke so much about. He was well known as one of those politicians full of new and fresh ideas. In fact, during the time I served in government and cabinet, I had the honor of receiving him on several occasions to discuss some of his ideas as they relate to the environment and land and marine resources. He took a particular interest in the work of the Institute of Marine Affairs as well. He also had, as politicians need to have to endure, he also had a good sense of humor and got along very well with his colleagues and the leadership of the United National Congress. He remained until the end to be a proud member of the United National Congress, a patriot, and a great contributor to the people of Princestown, who he served so well during that time. On this occasion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on behalf of the Leader of the Opposition, Mrs. Kamla Bissessar, on behalf of the United National Congress, members and activists, the people of Princestown, we wish to extend to his wife and children and relatives and friends our deepest condolences on his passing and to assure them of our support and strength during this sad period. We wish that they would have the comfort and strength to endure the sadness of this time. But we well remember his good work, and we are grateful for his service to Trinidad and Tobago. We're extremely grateful and thankful that he had the opportunity to come to this place and make such a sterling contribution to the people of Princestown and the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
During his tenure in this House, Dr. Mohammed contributed to many debates in this House and served his constituents well. I am advised that Dr. Mohammed was a very kind, witty, thoughtful, and assiduous individual. His life was certainly one of exceptional service to his country. I take this opportunity to express my deepest condolences to the Mohammed family during this time of mourning, and I pray that the Almighty grants them the comfort and strength needed in this time of bereavement. I now ask that we stand and observe a minute of silence as a mark of respect. May his soul rest in peace. Honorable members, I have directed the clerk to send a letter conveying our condolences to the family of the late Dr. Reza Mohammed.
Bills brought from the Senate, petitions, papers.
The Minister of Finance.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following papers. 1. The annual audited financial statements of the National Training Agency for the financial year ended September 30th, 2012. 2. The annual audited financial statements of the National Information and Communication Technology Company, IGovTT, for the financial year ended September 30th, 2020. The audited financial statements of Caroni 1975 Limited for the financial year ended June 30th, 2020. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the consolidated financial statements of the Trinidad and Tobago Unit Trust Corporation for the year ended December 31st, 2020. The ministerial response from the Ministry of Finance for the 4th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee on the examination of the audited financial statements of the National Information and Communication Technology Company Limited, IGovTT, for the financial years 2015 to 2019. And finally, the annual report of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago for the year ended September 30th, 2021. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that papers 1 to 3 be referred to the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee and paper 4 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee.
Honorable members, the question is that papers 1 to 3 be referred to the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee and paper number 4 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. Leader of the House.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have the honor to lay, on behalf of the Minister of Public Utilities, paper number 8, the annual administrative report of the Trinidad and Tobago Solid Waste Management Company Limited, SWIMCOL, for the period October 1st, 2015 to September 30th, 2016. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following papers. The annual administrative report of the Power Gen Company of Trinidad and Tobago Limited for the years ended 2008 to 2013.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Education, I have the honor to lay the following papers. Papers 16 and 17, the Administrative Report of the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago for the fiscal years 2015-2016 and 2018-2019. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
You may proceed, Madam.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following papers. Paper number 5, the response of the Auditor General to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee on the implementation of the recommendations of the 24th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, the PAAC, on the examination into the processing of the payment of pensions and gratuities of retired public officers and contracted employees. Service Commission for the period January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020. And paper number 18, the annual report of the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority for the financial year ended September 30th, 2021. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Reports from committees, Prime Minister's questions, urgent questions.
Member for Caroni East.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Minister of Health, will the Minister confirm that the government's quasi-safe zone policy for public sector workplaces will be implemented on Monday, the 17th of January, 2022?
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And may I say Happy New Year to you and all members of this honorable chamber. As has been publicly stated, the Honorable Prime Minister will address this issue in the shortest possible space of time.
Supplemental, member for Couva South.
Minister, can you inform this House if unvaccinated employees will be locked out from their respective workplaces effective the 17th of January 2022?
That question does not arise at this point in time.
Supplemental.
Minister, could you confirm if the circular to all permanent secretaries and heads of department dated the 31st of December 2021 under the hand of the acting permanent secretary, Claudel McKellar, has been revoked as it relates to public service and public sector vaccination program?
That matter will be dealt with by the appropriate minister and the appropriate persons. That is not a matter for the Minister of Health, but all these things will be clarified in the shortest space of time.
No more. Right. Member for Caroni East, next question.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Minister of Health, will the Minister indicate whether his ministry has to date launched an investigation into the reports by named young persons at the recent Tuesday, 11th January of 2022 NATOC press conference of developing serious side effects after taking the Pfizer vaccine?
Yes, thank you. And the answer is yes. And 2 lines of inquiry are currently being pursued. One, we are checking our vaccine databases to see if those persons were in fact vaccinated. Once that is determined, the information will be sent to the Chief Medical Officer for a clinical review. We are also reviewing the RHA system to see if these persons presented to any of our facilities. So the answer is yes, 2 lines of inquiries, and we are happy to get to the bottom of this issue.
Supplemental, member for Caroni East.
Thank you. Minister, are you aware that the FDA has recently advised that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a higher risk for immune thrombocytopenia up to 42 days after vaccination? And are any efforts being made to safeguard persons with low platelet counts?
Honourable member, in terms of the relevance based on the initial question, I would not be able to entertain that question.
Okay.
Supplemental again?
Yeah.
Proceed.
Minister, Okay. Minister, what additional steps would be taken to treat these persons should it be found that they suffered an adverse effect from the Pfizer vaccine?
Yeah, so all
Minister?
So all medical protocols will be followed. First of all, we have to find out their vaccination status. 2, we have to find out if in fact the effects noted were in fact due to vaccine or any other purpose or any other reason, either patient-centered or external. Based on that, then the appropriate treatment plan will be implemented.
Member for Caroni East, next question.
Minister, should an adverse effect be found, would this be reported?
Member,
Yeah.
another supplemental you have?
I was going to do another supplemental, yeah.
Okay, proceed.
Yeah. Minister, should an adverse effect be found, would this be reported to the WHO?
Yes, so as per protocol, all vaccine and drug manufacturers put out their clinical guidelines in their dossiers. What is reported up to WHO is any adverse event not listed as a known adverse event. So if it is an adverse event not listed on the literature for the particular vaccine or drug, we always report it up the chain of command to ParlView and WHO.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Minister of Health, will the Minister inform this House as to the status of the government's procurement of Pfizer's antiviral COVID-19 drug thus far?
Thank you.
Minister?
So yes, thank you. The name of the drug is called Paxlovid. As I stated publicly, we are in negotiations with Pfizer. We have signed a non-disclosure agreement. It must also be noted, Honorable Member, that Paxlovid is currently in short supply even in the United States. They don't have enough for their home market, short by hundreds of millions of doses. So we are in the market for it. I may also say WHO recently approved 2 other drugs from Eli Lilly, an oral immunosuppressant called baricitinib, but this is for severely ill persons who are critically ill. They have also approved one by GlaxoSmithKline, sotrovimab, which is a monoclonal antibody preparation to be administered intravenously for those at high risk of hospitalizations. The point I'm trying to make with all these therapies, they are not for garden variety COVID infection. There are protocols for its use. The reason I'm saying that, I don't want the population to get a false sense of security that this is a substitute for vaccinations. The drugs are currently in short supply, even in their home countries, and there are specific criteria for their use. So at the end of the day, we are in the marketplace for all of these therapies, but at the end of the day, they are used to treat persons rather than being vaccinated, which could help you prevent from being infected. Thank you very much.
Supplemental, Member for Caroni East. Proceed.
Thank you. Minister, has the government also been, has the government made a pre-order of the antiviral drug produced by Merck?
We have been in talks with all manufacturers, and yes, we have placed orders, but the non-disclosure agreements that we have prevents me from discussing any details of those potential purchases.
Supplemental?
Yes, supplemental.
Proceed.
Minister, so to the public, is there any time frame in which we can possibly get any of these drugs into our public healthcare system?
Minister?
Time frames are difficult to give right now. I just indicated that Paxlovid is even short supply in the United States. They can't supply their own home market. None of the companies so far can give us assurances that drugs can be supplied by X, Y, and Z date. We are in the market with all of these manufacturers, as I have always said, and as soon as the drugs are either registered, pre-registered, and available for export to this market, we are doing our best to secure them.
Member for Naparima.
Yeah. Will the Minister provide reasons for Trinidad and Tobago's high mortality figures and the urgent steps being taken to address them, given our current position on the Worldometer's global COVID-19 database?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much. So, Honourable Member, and through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, high is a relative term. We are currently number 30 out of 190 countries. So there are 160 countries below us. Other countries that are more resourced, and I would not call them, are 25, higher than us, 19, 31, higher than us. What we do is calculate our case fatality ratios, which is the number of deaths over the number of positive cases. In phase 1, when we had 8 deaths, our CFR was 6.2. That later dropped to 1, because at 6.2, it was 8 deaths out of a very small number of positive cases. So it's a skewed number. Then it dropped to 1. At this point in time, in the highest peak of our pandemic, our case fatality ratio is around 3. The global average is between 2 and 3. But I know the UNC wastes no time in painting Trinidad and Tobago in the worst possible light. What are we doing? We are looking at hospital care versus home care. You would have seen Dr. Arun Narayan Singh confirming what I said, that people are coming too late using ivermectin. 3, we rely on the public health measures. We are also relying on persons getting vaccinated. That will help us significantly. And one of the 4 things that we have to do is to combat misinformation. And we all know the sources of the misinformation.
Please, members, questions are asked. We have to abide by the answers based on the decorum of the House. You have a supplemental member for Naprima? Okay, you give it to Caroni East.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Minister, would the Ministry of Health be in the market for attracting any additional senior medical consultants to assist in the management of COVID-19 patients, given the severe death that we are currently experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago?
Again, trying to paint Trinidad and Tobago in the worst possible light. Our case fatality ratio...
One second, member. Again, members, it's not... the opportunity to have a supplemental question. Proceed.
Let me repeat. We are number 30 out of 190 countries. 2, our case fatality ratio is within global average. 3, healthcare professionals around the world are in short supply to be physically here, but we have always relied on expert advice from CARPHA, which advises CARICOM governments, PAHO, WHO, and the medical team and research teams at the University of the West Indies and their foreign institutions.
Supplemental? Carnies?
Minister, between December the 15th and December the 28th of 2021, Johns Hopkins University has shown that this country has consistently been in the top spot globally in daily confirmed deaths per million. Can you ascertain if this data is correct?
Yes, and we have addressed that very often. There are different measures that different bodies use. What we use is the case fatality ratio, and we have been consistent. Our case fatality ratio was at a low of 1, a high of 6.2, and it is currently around 3. The global average for case fatality ratio is between 2 and 3. And we have consistently used the same metric all through the pandemic.
Questions for oral answer?
Leader of the House.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are 5 questions for oral answer. We will answer all 5. There are no questions for written response. Thank you.
Just for the records, members, question number 36 has been withdrawn by the member for Naparima. Member for Point of Pay.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Question number 34 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, NGC has not borrowed any money in the past 12 months.
Member for Naparima, we go on to question number 37. Oh, sorry. Member for Point of Pay, number 35.
Deputy Speaker. Question number 35 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the average estimated gas production for the fiscal year 2021, which is between the period October 2020 to September 2021, was 2.574 mmcf per day. 2,574 mmcf per day. It is expected that there will be an improvement in gas production in fiscal year 2022 as new projects such as Shell's Block 5C, BHP's Ruby Delaware, and BPTT's Matapal ramp up production, and new projects such as Shell's Colibri project, BPTT's Cassia project come on stream. We're also hoping in a short time frame to start getting some onshore gas from Touchstone.
Supplementar, Member for Point of Pay.
Thank you, Minister, for your response. You stated the average has been 2.574, I think. But the Minister of Finance in his budget statement of 2022 quoted the average gas production of 2.77. Minister, could you state why there is that discrepancy between the
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries?
Thank you very much. At the time when the Minister of Finance was using those figures, it could have been that there were still projections in the preparation of the budget. What we're giving you now is an accurate figure that has been averaged over the period of time.
Member for Naparima.
Question number 37 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Minister of Finance and the Attorney General continue to work aggressively towards resolving all outstanding legal, administrative, and operational issues regarding the European list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes. In this context, the Attorney General in November 2021 held meetings with our European counterparts on this issue. We are working closely with the support and guidance of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, their Global Forum, and the Base Erosion and Profit Sharing BEPS Inclusive Framework, and the European Union's Code of Conduct Group to ensure compliance with all standards and subsequent removal from the European list in the soonest possible time frame. We are in regular communication with these bodies and are working assiduously with a view to being moved to the grey list in 2022, with the ultimate objective of being deemed to be fully compliant as soon as possible.
Supplemental, Member for Naparima.
Is the Minister aware that an EU Minister from Denmark, the Minister of Taxation, Morten Børsted, described Trinidad and Tobago as belonging, and I quote, in the corner or nook of shame, and Denmark has terminated its double taxation agreement with Trinidad and Tobago as a result of our blacklisted position.
And the question is?
Yeah, is he aware?
Yes, I am aware.
Minister of Finance.
Yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am aware that this is as a result of the failure of your government to do what it was supposed to do.
Supplemental, Member for Naparima.
Is the Minister aware that repeatedly your government has promised us to get off the blacklist and have failed from 2017 to date?
Minister of Finance.
I am well aware of that, and just this week I wrote the European Union in furtherance of our objective to move to the grey list in 2022.
Question number 38, Member for Naparima.
Could be that horse all you want to know.
Question number 38 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in an attempt to detect and prevent cell phones from entering the nation's prisons, the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service currently utilizes handheld metal detectors at all 9 prison institutions. The Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service also receives support with electronic measures from the primary intelligence agency, the Strategic Services Agency, which provides technological support to all relevant law enforcement agencies in keeping with the SSA Act and the Interception of Communications Act. Notwithstanding this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and given the sensitive nature of some of these issues and the measures and their implications for national security, it would be inimical to the interest of national security to publicly disclose more than I just have, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I thank you.
Why are we not using technology used in the federal correctional complex in the United States, where surveillance cameras have a 360-degree view, motion detection sensors, and face detection technology located all over the prison to help in identifying inmates and and therefore reduce opportunities for inmates to make hits from the prisons?
Minister of National Security.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in respect of the specific issue of facial recognition techniques, the member for Naparima should recall that we had put a system in place to use that technology in this country, and he and his friends of the UNC as a government dismantled every element of it. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, in respect of his more general question, I don't know particularly where he went, but I know we use...
Properly, please.
The member for Naparima. We use technologies, some of which he has just mentioned, and that which is available to the government and people for our protection in Trinidad and Tobago. And as I said, and I repeat, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are some elements of what we do that it would be inimical to hear expressed, which is his intention to expose what we are doing to certain people, undesirables in the society.
Thank you. Supplemental, member for Naparima?
Yes.
Supplemental, Naparima.
Can I not raise 48.6? He has imputed improper motives, indicating that I want criminals to learn about our technology. That is wicked. That is wicked.
Okay, member.
Yes, sir.
As a result of the desk stamping, I have not heard you clearly. Could you repeat?
The minute I am quoting the minute 48.6, imputing improper motives. He has the honourable member has indicated that I am maliciously trying to get criminals to learn about the detection surveillance equipment in our prisons. I have no such objective, and it is wicked and malicious.
Okay, thank you, member. Thank you. Overruled. Proceed.
I expect that.
Yes,
Minister.
Supplemental. Supplemental has the relationship with the Prison Officers Association changed, given that 2 months ago, its president indicated that it had lost all faith in national security to address the issue of hits?
Minister of National Security.
The relationship between the Member of Parliament for Laventille West, the Minister of National Security, and the Prison Service Association has changed. It continues to get better in the public interest and in the interest of the Trinidad and Tobago Prison Service.
The Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am authorized by Cabinet to make the following statement. and I thank you for the opportunity to deliver this statement on the annual report of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago for the year ended September the 30th, 2021. In accordance with Section 18 of the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Director of the FIUTT submitted to the Minister its annual report for the year ended September 30th, 2021, which has been laid in Parliament today, I believe. Today, I would like to outline to this House some of the main highlights of this report. In the area of combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism, the following legislative actions were undertaken. Firstly, in December 2020, the Miscellaneous Provisions Financial Action Task Force Compliance Act number 25 of 2020 was enacted to inter alia fortify the anti-money laundering, counter financing of terrorism, counter proliferation financing, also known as AML, CFT, CPF regime in Trinidad and Tobago by amending the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, also known as POCA, and the Anti-Terrorism Act. Secondly, during the period under review, other legislative actions were taken to bolster the AML, CFT, CPF regime. These include the assent of the Miscellaneous Provisions FATF Compliant Act 2020 on December 18, 2020, which amended the Central Bank Act to inter alia empower the bank to administer administrative fines under any written law under which it has a supervisory role or general administration. Additionally, the assent of the Evidence Amendment Act 2021 on February 25, 2021, which amended the second schedule of the Evidence Act to include the words Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago, thus making it possible that the FIU documents may be received in evidence in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago and all legal proceedings once certified by the Director, and the assent of the Gambling, Gaming and Betting Control Act on July 12, 2021, which ensures that the FIU continues to be the supervisory authority responsible for the AML, CFT, CPF supervision of gambling establishments, and thereby requiring new establishments to apply for registration with the FIU within 5 business days of obtaining the license to operate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the area of fostering a culture of compliance, over the period October 2020 to September 30th, 2021, the FIU continued to adapt and adopt procedures to overcome the challenges experienced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In so doing, the FIU encouraged and accepted electronic submissions of completed FIU registration forms, such as the Form RG1, along with all supporting documents via email. Accordingly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for this reporting period, 506 entities registered with the FIU, bringing the total number of registrants to 3,766 as at September 30th, 2021. This represented a 54% increase from the previous reporting period. The continued compliance of supervised entities to register with the FIU within 3 months of commencing business activity or incorporation as a company in accordance with Regulation 28.1 is attributed to the realignment of the FIU strategies in response to the changing business environment, the electronic registration I just spoke of. Notwithstanding the challenges of the pandemic restrictions, the FIU also continued to receive risk assessment questionnaires from the Registrar General's Department in accordance with the Non-Profit Organizations Act of 2019. As a result, there was a 128% increase in these submissions from 1,411 non-profit organizations as they sought to meet the extended deadline of January 22. The FIU was also amended, the Act that is, during the reporting period to include Section 18A, which treats with the deregistration of a supervised entity. Businesses and individuals that no longer perform functions of a supervised entity may apply for deregistration in accordance with this amendment. Accordingly, 37 entities deregistered over the period. With respect to the supervised entity's obligation to appoint suitably qualified candidates to perform the roles of compliance officer and alternate compliance officer, the FIU took a proactive approach and adopted measures to ensure compliance with this obligation. As a result, the FIU observed an increase in the submission of compliance officer fit and proper questionnaires during the period. In terms of terrorist property reports, procedures to facilitate the secure electronic submission of quarterly property terrorist reports were implemented by the FIU. This measure resulted in more timely submissions from financial institutions and allowed for faster review of the QTRs by the FIU. Also, with regard to internal controls, independent testing was conducted by competent professionals to assess the adequacy of the AML, CFT, CPF policies and procedures implemented by supervised entities. Though this is a legal obligation, it is also a compliance tool beneficial to both the entity and the FIU. A total of 1,041 AML, CFT, CPF compliance examinations were also conducted on 972 supervised entities in the period. Meanwhile, 88% of non-regulated financial institutions, such as credit unions, building societies, and money of value transfer services registered with the FIU, were tested for compliance. The FIU's outreach and awareness efforts to the NPO sector also expanded by 33% during the period, due to the conduct of 12 virtual and outreach awareness sessions. The FIU further embarked on a digital outreach initiative of development videos to widen its engagement of supervised entities, stakeholders, and the public. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the area of financial analysis, during the reporting period, the FIU received 1,638 suspicious transaction reports or suspicious activity reports, representing a decrease of 11% compared to the previous period. Of these, 1,593 were submitted via FIU Connect, and the other 69 were received via manual submissions. The banking sector submitted 82% of the SDRs or SARs, followed by the MVTs accounting for 7%. During the reporting period, submissions from insurance companies, investment companies, mortgage companies, jewelers, private members club all decreased over the period. This can be attributed to the restrictions in the operations of these businesses as a result of COVID-19. Of the 1,638 STRs, SERs received, 16%, 262 reports, were associated with the demonetization of the cotton-based $100 bills. Of these, 24 reports were submitted under Section 52 of the POCA. The total monetary value of the 1,638 STRs, SARs received amounted to $3,177,713,721, of which $2,086,588,624 were completed transactions and $1,091,125,097 were attempted transactions. This represents a 136% increase in completed transactions and a 96% decrease in attempted transactions when compared to the previous period. Suspected tax evasion ranked the highest among the 5 most common reasons for the submission of STRs or SARs, representing 534 persons. This was followed by money laundering, 477 persons, suspicious financial activity, 290 persons, fraud, 231 persons, and breach of exchange control, 40 persons. These 5 suspected criminal conducts accounted for 96% of the total number of STRs and SARs, and 98% of the total monetary value of all combined. With regard to the financing of terrorism, the FIU received 8 STRs, SARs on suspected financing of terrorism, compared to 12 in the previous period. This represented a 33% decrease of financing of terrorism-related STRs, SARs, may be attributable to the apparent collapse of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. Overall, 7 intelligence reports were disseminated to local and foreign law enforcement agencies and foreign FIUs. The FIU took note of the change in administration in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. This change has caused the Egmont Group to disconnect the Financial Transactions and Report Analysis Center of Afghanistan, their FIU, from the Egmont Secure website. The FATF also expressed its concern about the current and evolving money laundering, financial of terrorism risk environment in Afghanistan. In the area of strategic alliances, cooperation, and collaboration, the FAO received 11 requests from foreign authorities, representing a 50% decrease compared to the previous period. These requests featured a total of 26 subjects, in contrast to the 204 in the previous year. The suspected criminal conduct in the majority of cases was corruption, with 6 requests comprising 14 subjects. In the area of resources and infrastructure, 18 contract vacancies were filled, while 3 staff members exited for other opportunities, and 1 staff member passed away. Attracting and retaining staff to the FIU continues to be a challenge. However, in collaboration with the HR department of the Ministry of Finance, the FIU has commenced the recruitment of persons to fill vacant positions. In terms of its strategic priorities for 2022, the FIU will continue the recruitment and training of staff. Additionally, measures will be undertaken to ensure the safety and well-being of staff. The FIU will also continue its digitalization initiatives in keeping with government's thrust for digital transformation and a digital public service. Further legislative amendments will be introduced in areas such as the extension of the range of sanctions to include administrative fines, provision of a clear understanding of CFT, CPF obligations for NPOs, amendments to the Act, and the inclusion of the regulation, supervision, and monitoring of fintechs, virtual assets, and virtual asset service providers for AML, CFT, CPF. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the FIU intends to take a proactive approach to continually meeting and surpassing FATF recommendations 29 and immediate outcome 6 in particular. There will be specific focus on the continued provision of timely reports on existing and emerging trends, patterns and red flags alerts of financial crimes affecting stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago, continued provision of operational and strategic analysis products to LEAs and competent authorities, active promotion of AML, CFT, CPF compliance, awareness, supervision, and enforcement to supervise entities, NPOs, and electronic money issuers. Continued implementation of IT solutions to improve the supervision process, strengthening the cooperation and collaboration with our domestic and international stakeholders to further improve our analysis products in the fight against money laundering, financing of terrorism, and PF, and seeking to further obtain and have access to the widest possible range of financial, administrative, law enforcement, and commercially held data to effectively and efficiently perform its functions. I thank you.
Proceed.
Introduction of bills. The Miscellaneous Provision, Testing and Identification Bill 2022 in the name of the Attorney General. The Whistleblower Protection Bill 2022 in the name of the Minister of National Security. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the House and moved by a minister.
Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, having regard to the decision of the Senate to establish the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on the Fisheries Management No. 2 Bill 2020, I beg to move that the following 6 members be appointed to serve with an equal number from the Senate as follows. Ms. Shamfa Kajo, member. Mr. Brian Manning, member. Mr. Stephen McClashy, member. Mr. Kennedy Richards, member. Mr. Rushdan Pare, member. Mr. Ravi Ratiram, member. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Yes.
Honorable members, the question is that the following 6 members be appointed to serve on the Joint Select Committee on the Fisheries Management No. 2 Bill 2020, with an equal number from the Senate. Ms. Shamfa Kojo, member. Mr. Brian Manning, member. Mr. Stephen McClashy, member. Mr. Kennedy Richards, member. Mr. Rushton Parry, member. Mr. Ravi Ratiram, member. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, having regard to the decision of the Senate to establish the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on the Shipping Bill 2020, I beg to move that the following 6 members be appointed to serve with an equal number from the Senate as follows. Mrs. Penelope Beckles Robinson, member. Mr. Marvin Gonzalez, member. Mrs. Lisa Morris Julian, member. Mr. Keith Scotland, member. Mr. Devendranath Tanku, member. Mr. Dinesh Rambali, member. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Honourable members, the question is that the following 6 members be appointed to serve on the Joint Select Committee on the Shipping Bill 2020, with an equal number from the Senate. Mrs. Penelope Beckles Robinson, member. Mr. Marvin Gonzalez, member. Mrs. Lisa Morris Julian, member. Mr. Keith Scotland, member. Mr. Devendranath Tanku, member. Mr. Dinesh Rambali, member. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, having regard to the decision of the House made pursuant to Standing Order 79.3, I beg to move that the Representation of the People Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020 be referred to a Joint Select Committee hereby established. Be it resolved that this committee be mandated to adopt the work of the Joint Select Committee in the first session and report by April 30th, 2022. And be it further resolved that, subject to the concurrence of the Senate on the establishment of the Joint Select Committee on the Representation of the People Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, that this House appoint the following 6 members to sit with an equal number from the Senate on this committee. Mrs. Camille Robinson Regis, member. Mr. Colm Imbert, member. Mr. Fitzgerald Hines, member. Ms. Shamfa Kajo, member. Mr. Saddam Hosein, member. Mr. Devendranath Tanku, member. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Honourable members, the question is that the Representation of the People Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020 be referred to a Joint Select Committee hereby established. That this committee be mandated to adopt the work of the Joint Select Committee in the first session and report by April 30th, 2022. That subject to the concurrence of the Senate on the establishment of the Representation of the People Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, that this House appoint the following 6 members to sit with an equal number from the Senate on this committee. Mrs. Camille Robinson Regis, member. Mr. Colm Imbert, member. Mr. Fitzgerald Hines, member. Ms. Shamfa Kojo, member. Mr. Saddam Hussein, member. Mr. Devendranath Tanku, member. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, notwithstanding the resolution of the House on Wednesday, September 15, 2021, in relation to the speaking time during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, I beg to move that for the debate on the motion Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Number 2, Regulations only, that the speaking time be as follows. The Minister of Finance, 45 minutes. The first responder, 45 minutes. All other speakers, 20 minutes. And the mover in reply, 20 minutes, all with no extension. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Honourable members, The question is that for the debate on the public procurement and disposal of public property, number 2, regulations, 2021 only, that the speaking time be as follows. The Minister of Finance, 45 minutes. The first responder, 45 minutes. All other speakers, 20 minutes. And the mover in reply, 20 minutes. All with no extensions. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it.
Public business, government business, motions.
The Minister of Finance. And it's 45 minutes, Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank the House for allowing the short increase in speaking time. This matter that we are about today, but before I go into that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move motion number 1 standing in my name. And in moving this motion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I seek the leave of the House in accordance with Standing Order 51 to debate along with this matter motions number 2, 210 inclusive on the order paper which relate to the same subject.
Honourable members, is this the wish of the House? Aye. Proceed.
I also wish to thank honourable members opposite for their consideration. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this matter that we are about, and I will read the motion, whereas it is provided by Section 63 of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015, hereinafter referred to as the Act, that the Minister, on the recommendation of the Office of Procurement Regulation, may make regulations to give effect to the provisions of the Act, and whereas it is provided by Section 63(3) that regulations made under the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution of Parliament, and whereas the Minister of Finance, on the recommendation of the Office of Procurement Regulation, caused the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings number 2, Regulations 2021 to be prepared, and whereas the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings number 2, Regulations were laid in the House of Representatives on the 13th day of December 2021, and whereas it is expedient that the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings number 2, Regulations 2021 now be affirmed, be it resolved that the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings number 2, Regulations 2021 be approved. As I was saying, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry.
Honourable members, I will now propose the question for debate. Right. Proceed, member.
Thank you very much. We've been at this matter as a parliament for quite a while. With respect to the regulations that we are dealing with today, these were first laid in this House in July of 2021, just before we went on the recess. And a suitable period was given for public comment. We received quite significant public comment and relayed the regulations in September of 2021, just before the budget exercise. Again, we allowed further public comment, And in the months of September, October, November, I can safely say, we received 43 pages, not 43 comments, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 43 pages of comments sent to us by the Office of Procurement Regulation, which on inquiry was a collation of comments sent to that office by stakeholders, and would also have included some comments from the Office of Procurement Regulation itself. This is a very, very complex matter. And the Ministry of Finance was fortunate to be able to identify a very experienced attorney, experienced in the area of public procurement because it is a specialist area. And with the assistance of that attorney and the staff at the ministry, including the minister in the ministry, Mr. Manning, who I wish to compliment for having assisted me substantially in getting this matter to where it is today, and the Treasury Solicitors Department as well, our legal unit in the ministry, and our expert consultant, we were able to review in fairly short order the voluminous nature of the comments made on the regulations that had been laid in July and in September. We were then able, just before we broke for the Christmas period, to lay the final version of the public procurement regulations on the 13th of December, and this is the matter that we are about today. I have been in touch with the Office of the Procurement Regulator, and the comment that came back from that office is that they can work with these regulations that are before us today. Let me also put some context into this matter. It is not very well known that there has been a plethora of decisions in the courts over the years as to the extent to which a court can get involved in the award of contracts, particularly within the public sector. And the effect of all of the decisions, which go way, way back many, many years, and include two decisions in Trinidad and Tobago, two quite well-known decisions. One of them was the case of NH International versus Udicot, and the other was a case involving Spancrete and again Udicot. The first case was over the construction of a building, or the award of a contract for the construction of a building. And the second one that I referred to, although it preceded it, was with respect to the award of a contract for an overpass or an interchange at the intersection of the Uriah Butler and the Churchill Roosevelt highways. The court in both instances, in the case of NH International versus Udicot, at first instance, and in the Court of Appeal, the court concluded that there were insufficient public law elements involved in the matter to allow the court to intervene and to stand in the shoes, as it were, of the evaluation committee and determine whether the contract award should be set aside or varied, as the case may be. A similar decision was arrived at in the Spancrete case, in the case of the interchange, and the judge, I believe it was Justice Mohammed, arrived at a similar conclusion using Canadian authorities at the time. So that the law in Trinidad and Tobago and the law in the English common law jurisdictions was that unless there are sufficient public law elements within our procurement regime, a court would not easily intervene in a matter of an award of a contract unless it can demonstrate that there were allegations of corruption that could be proven, breaches of statutory duties and obligations. So following in particular that case, that NH versus Udicott case, there was a movement coming from our local construction industry that we get to the point of introducing public law elements into our procurement process. And I'll explain what I mean by a public law element. In the European Union, for example, there's a very sophisticated procurement regime governed by legislation and subsidiary legislation, and there's continuous upgrade and amendment of their procurement laws, so that tender rules in the European Union are actually prescribed in law. In our situation, the only public law element in our environment is what is known as the Central Tenders Board. And it is possible for an aggrieved contractor to go to court and seek judicial review of a decision of the Central Tenders Board. But many contract awards, in fact, the most contract awards in Trinidad and Tobago, now for many, many years, are done by way of state enterprises, by wholly owned state enterprises such as NIPDEC, or quasi-state enterprises such as NIPDEC, wholly owned enterprises such as NIDCO, such as Udicott, and so on. And while a contractor could challenge the Central Tenders Board, the development of the law did not allow a contractor to easily challenge an award made by a state enterprise, unless, as I said, they could prove fraud or a breach of obligation. So there was this movement within the construction industry that we create a public procurement regime that will allow the court to intervene in a matter if there is a breach of process. And the evolution of all of this is what we are talking about today. We are looking now, there is an act, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, but the act cannot operate without subsidiary legislation, which is the regulations that are before us today. I want to tell honorable members, there is a view that this will be the panacea and the solution to all problems in Trinidad and Tobago with respect to procurement. But understand what we are doing today. Today, we are for the first time introducing public law elements into the procurement by state enterprises. And we will now be inviting the court to get involved in the award of contracts by state enterprises. It is not as simple as I just expressed. Of course, you have an intervening body. You have the Office of the Procurement Regulator, who would establish rules and guidelines and serve as an arbiter in the middle in terms of dealing with disputes. You have a review board, you have an appeal board, you have quite a sophisticated alternative dispute resolution process in the middle there. But we are now, for the first time, introducing a situation where the court can, and probably will, intervene in the award of contracts within the public sector, in particular within state enterprises. So let's deal with the matter at hand now. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, how much more time do I have?
You finish at 3:18.
Okay. All right, thank you. Just over half an hour. Before this House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a package of 10 regulations required under the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. These are the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Participation in Procurement, number 2, Regulations 2021. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Pre-Qualification and Pre-Selection, number 2, Regulations 2021. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Procurement Methods and Procedures, number 2, Regulations 2021. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Ineligibility Proceedings, number 2, Regulations 2021. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Challenge Proceedings, number 2, Regulations 2021. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings, Regulations. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Retention and Disposal of Personal Property, Regulations 2021. And the last 3, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Evaluation Regulations 2021, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Miscellaneous Regulations 2021, and the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Procurement of Consultants Regulations 2021. As indicated previously, these regulations were laid in the House on the 2nd of July 2021. And from July 2nd to November 26, 2021, the regulations were open to public comment through the Ministry of Finance, through the Parliament, and also through the Office of Procurement Regulation. As I indicated previously, all of the voluminous comments were considered, adjustments were made, and the regulations were once again laid in the House on the 13th of December 2021. These 10 regulations provide a very important underpinning of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act and give details and mechanisms for critical matters and procedures required under the Act. They set the stage for the ensuing full proclamation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, an event that has attracted much attention over time, and an event which it is felt and believed requires introduction in order to modernize the mode of doing business within the public sector and also to allow greater transparency. These regulations require affirmative resolution of Parliament. But I will also touch on other regulations required under the Act that do not, that would become law unless negatived by negative resolution. The additional regulations that I have just spoken about touch and concern the Review Board, an important entity under the Act that has oversight of the Office of Procurement Regulation on certain matters, because what we are trying to do is to avoid the first default or the first consequence of a grievance being litigation and an approach to the court. This Act truly is a manifestation of alternative dispute resolution, because you have the Office of Procurement Regulation as the first arbiter, and then you have the Review Board as the second arbiter before the matter gets into court. And one would hope, and experience has shown in other countries, that 90% of matters are disposed of at that level, and just a few would go on to require the intervention of the High Court, or the Supreme Court as it is called. Now let us look at the actual 10 regulations I just announced. Firstly, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Participation Procurement Number 2 Regulations 2021. Participation in procurement is required for the establishment of the rules. This particular regulation I'm speaking about, the Participation in Procurement Regulation, is required to establish the rules under which the procuring entity will comply with Section 5(1)(c) of the Act. It seeks to promote sustainable procurement, sustainable development, and local industry development. These objectives are achieved by establishing a domestic preference, which is set out in the bidding documents when bids are being sought internationally and from local suppliers. A margin of preference is a measure that recognizes the benefits of domestic goods or services and applies to goods manufactured exclusively in Trinidad and Tobago, goods partially manufactured or assembled in Trinidad and Tobago, where the supplier or contractors establish to the satisfaction of the contracting entity that the proportion of domestic value, local content, added to the total value of those goods is equal to or greater than 35% of the ex-work price of the goods. Section 5(1) of the Act requires all public procurement to be guided by the principles of accountability, integrity, transparency, and value for money, efficiency, fairness, equity, and to instill public confidence. This regulation, number 1, therefore supports government's priority of economic growth by making procurement proceeds more transparent and effective for businesses and public bodies. Focus is placed on getting the right supplier with the best bids and enabling suppliers to compete in a more effective and transparent manner. These provisions are in keeping with the government's priority of ensuring that local companies, particularly small and medium enterprises, benefit from public procurement, which is a driver for economic growth. In addition, in their bids, suppliers and contractors are required to certify that the necessary capacity exists where domestic value is to be added. In the case of international competitive bids, a preference may be applied to bids that propose the employment of 65% or more of domestic labor. In applying a preference, the nationality of the manufacturer, supplier, or contractor would not be a condition for eligibility, just the 65% local content I just referred to. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the bidding and solicitation documents must also state the documentation required as evidence of eligibility for the margin of preference, the percentage of the margin, and the manner in which it would be applied during evaluation. The maximum percentage permitted to be added for domestic preference, that is to say, for contractors and suppliers based in Trinidad and Tobago, in these regulations is 10%. So that local contractors will be given a preference margin of 10% when bidding against international contractors. Regulations 6.1 to 6.8 set out the rules by which the office will fulfill the requirements of Section 26.1 of the Act, which requires the office to establish a database known as the Procurement Depository, where suppliers or contractors can submit information on their qualifications and experience. Regulation 6.5 ensures that suppliers or contractors registered in the Procurement Depository continue to maintain a registered status unless they are added to the ineligibility list in accordance with Section 58.6 of the Act. Regulation 6.8 makes it an offense to give false information or make false statements to the office in relation to the Procurement Depository database, and such an offense is liable on conviction to a fine of $500,000 or imprisonment of 1 year. As you can see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very serious regulation. So a procurement depository where suppliers and contractors will submit information on their qualifications and experience will be established by the Office of Procurement Regulation, and if you provide false information, you'll be liable to a fine of $500,000 and imprisonment for 1 year, up to. Number 2, public procurement and disposal of public property pre-qualification and pre-selection, number 2, Regulations 2021. Regulation 3.1 allows suppliers and contractors to upload information to the procurement depository in order that procuring entities may pre-qualify them on an ongoing basis in accordance with Section 29.1 of the Act. This is absolutely essential, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There have been instances of which I have knowledge of public entities awarding contracts based on a pre-qualified list which has not been developed in accordance with any known process. Regulation 4 allows procuring entities to pre-qualify suppliers using the procurement depository and the list of suppliers and contractors contained therein. The procurement entity can assess those suppliers or contractors on a pass-fail basis to determine whether they should be pre-qualified. The procurement entity, and by that I mean a procurement entity, is any state enterprise, statutory authority, department of government. That is what we are calling a procurement entity in this paradigm. The procurement entity can also engage with suppliers and contractors to confirm that the information in the procurement depository is accurate. Regulations 4.4 set out the procedure where there are no pre-qualified suppliers or contractors for the category of goods, works or services, or where the number of pre-qualified suppliers or contractors is less than the required number or deemed insufficient for a competitive process. That would then lead to selective tendering or sole select tendering. Regulation 4.5 requires that in situations outlined above, the procuring entity must issue a public invitation to pre-qualify. So no secret pre-qualification, must be done publicly. Regulation 5 outlines the information required by procuring entities from suppliers or contractors pre-qualifying and ensures that the requirements of Section 29(1) of the Act are satisfied. Regulation 6.1 requires the procuring entity to respond within a reasonable time. Moreover, Regulation 6.3, and by the way, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these regulations, these numbers I am calling are within the rubric of the overall set of regulations, whether it's number 2, number 3, and so on. So, Regulation 6.1 requires the procuring entity to respond within a reasonable time. Regulation 6.3 requires that where a response to a request for clarification might be of interest to other suppliers or contractors, the procuring entity shall, without identifying the source of the request, communicate the response to all suppliers or contractors to whom the procuring entity provided the pre-qualification documents. Regulation 7 requires that procuring entities promptly notify each supplier or contractor presenting an application to pre-qualify its written decision as to whether or not that supplier or contractor has been pre-qualified, so that there must be a notification to someone who is seeking pre-qualification whether they have been pre-qualified or not. They shall not be left in limbo. And if the supplier was unsuccessful, then the procuring entity must give reasons for the non-pre-qualification. So by now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you would see how sophisticated these regulations are. Regulation 9 allows procuring entities a basis for making a pre-selection of suppliers and contractors. Regulation 9.2 allows the procuring entity to pre-select suppliers and contractors where the pre-qualified list of suppliers or contractors is prohibitively lengthy and would result in the public body spending an inordinate amount of time on the evaluation of bids or proposals. In this situation, the procuring entity will invite all pre-qualified suppliers or contractors to participate in pre-selection proceedings in order to establish a shortlist. So again, this will allow not just selective tendering or sole select, but also shortlisting of potentially pre-qualified contractors. Regulation 9.5 requires that for situations involving high risk or high value procurements where there are no pre-qualified suppliers or contractors to pre-select, that the procuring entity issue a public invitation for pre-qualification in accordance with the criteria set out in Regulation 4, and the conditions under sub-regulation 4.4 will apply. Regulation 10 requires that an invitation for pre-selection specify the minimum and maximum number of suppliers that would be invited to submit a bid or proposal post the pre-selection exercise. Regulation 11 regulates the use of the pre-selection option by procuring entities by stating it shall be issued a prerequisite in relation to a specific procurement activity. Regulation 12 requires that pre-selected applicants be assessed against additional evaluation scoring relevant to the procurement proceedings in question, with a maximum and minimum score applied to each criterion, and the applicants being ranked in accordance with the overall scores obtained. So again, all of this is in the interest of transparency. Regulation 13 allows the procuring entity to invite bids from the suppliers or contractors who achieve the required score for pre-qualification. So that is a summary of the pre-qualification regulations. I go now to 3, the public procurement and disposal of public property procurement methods and procedures. Number 2, regulations. These regulations set out the methods and procedures that procuring entities shall use to ensure that they manage the risk involved in procuring goods, services, and works with a view to achieving value for money. That is the overall objective, value for money. Regulation 3 stipulates that procuring entities develop an annual procurement plan, and Regulation 4 specifies that specific threshold values be established in special guidelines and handbooks. And procurement entities generally do not split transaction values. And I'm aware that this happens, that people attempt or do split transaction values so as to circumvent the approval process. Regulation 4.45 allows some flexibility to the general rule where there are clear and calculable economic or technical advantages. Regulation 5 to 7 outline the process of open bidding that procurement entities shall follow. Regulation 8 details the process for limited bidding. Regulations 10 to 14 cover other methods of procurement, including single source and sole source bidding. Regulation 17 provides for the establishment of framework agreements for works or services that are required on a repetitive basis. Regulation 21 provides for the establishment of a procurement and disposal advisory committee, the functions of the committee, and the officers of the procuring entity who shall form that committee. Regulation 22 outlines the information that must be included in an invitation to tender and stipulates that the information may be made available in electronic or hard copy format with minimum cost for printing and distribution. And this is fundamental. You don't want to restrict people from procurement by making them pay an excessive fee to get copies of tender documents, for example. So this is fundamental to the achievement of transparency under Section 5.1 of the Act. Regulation 28 stipulates the manner in which technical specifications must be communicated in order to avoid unfair advantage being granted to any supplier or contractor. Regulations 30 to 34 set out the criteria and methodology for the evaluation of bids and determining the successful supplier or contractor. Regulation 36 allows procuring entities to request advance payment guarantees where applicable. I go down to 4. These regulations provide the mechanism through which Section 58.4 of the Act shall be effected in eligibility proceedings. This requires the Minister, on the advice of the Office of Procurement Regulation, to specify the mechanism and manner for adding a supplier or contractor to the ineligibility list, and also for removing a supplier contractor from that list. And that is a list where persons are essentially disqualified from bidding on particular matters. Regulation 7 provides for 3 forms of ineligibility: a letter of reprimand, a conditional non-debarment, and for the most serious breaches of the Act, ineligibility for up to 10 years. This would be major fraud and so on, collusion, conspiracy, that sort of thing, conspiracy to defraud the public, and so on. Regulation 11 allows a supplier or contractor the opportunity to seek a review of the declaration of ineligibility where the supplier has complied with remedial measures or new evidence and facts emerge that exonerate the supplier or contractor. 5. Challenge proceedings. These regulations outline the mechanism by which a supplier or contractor may challenge the decision of a procuring entity for non-compliance with the Act or due to any action or decision likely to cause loss or injury, as provided for in Part 5, Sections 49 to 52 of the Act. Regulation 2 establishes the procedure for review and references the provisions of Section 51 and 2 of the Act. Regulation 4 establishes the basis on which the office may dismiss an application for review, largely confined to the following 3 criteria. The application for a review is manifestly without merit. The application for a review is out of time. And there is lack of sufficient standing, locus, pecuniary or otherwise economic interest in the procurement proceeding. This is to avoid persons who have no involvement or association whatsoever with a procurement matter from diving into a matter to stop or overturn a contract. Regulations 5 and 6 establish the office as being responsible for conducting and managing applications for review. Regulation 7 guarantees a party to the review the right of representation by an attorney at law, engineer, quantity surveyor, valuator, or other qualified person. Regulations 8 and 9 establish the specifics on a submission of an application for review and the submission of a reply by the procuring entity. So again, That is the first stage in the process. The person would complain to the ministry, the state enterprise, the statutory authority, and ask for review. If the entity does not agree to the review or does not agree with the challenge that is being made, it then goes to the Office of Procurement Regulation for further review, and then goes to review board for further review, all in an effort to prevent costly litigation. Regulation 11, subject to the provisions of Section 54 and 57 of the Act, provide the officer with the ability to consider whether or not procurement proceedings should be suspended. Regulations 12, 13, 14, and 15 set out the procedure for the hearing and the review. The sixth set of regulations, record of procurement proceedings. These regulations make it mandatory for each procuring entity to maintain an easily accessible record of each procurement proceeding and establishes the information that should form part of that record. The regulations also require that the procuring entity submit a summary of its procurement activities to the Office of Procurement Regulation in accordance with the handbooks and guidelines approved for the entity by the office. 7. Retention and disposal of personal property. These regulations outline the procedures for the retention and disposal of personal property, mainly assets other than real property, such as stores and equipment, covered by Part 6 of the Act. Regulations 3 and 4 stipulate a risk-based approach to the retention and disposal of personal property and require the office to approve handbooks and guidelines setting out procedures. Regulation 5 requires a public body to establish a written policy for the retention of stores and equipment in accordance with the good governance principles of accountability, transparency, integrity, and value for money. Regulation 6 mandates that public bodies be responsible for the disposal of its stores and equipment which are deemed unserviceable, obsolete, or surplus. Regulation 7.2 requires that where any disposal of personal property is made to an employee of a public body and the net book value or residual is in excess of $100,000, that the office be informed of the details of the item, disposal price, and the name of the employee. And we're talking about something like a motor car. Yeah, thanks. So it means that if a procuring entity wants to dispose of a motor car, for example, to one of its employees and the value is over $100,000, they must communicate with the office and let the Office of Public Procurement know so that action can be taken if necessary. 8, evaluation. These evaluation regulations outline the factors that should be considered when evaluating submissions, including both the price and non-price factors. And there's a general concern that public bodies, when evaluating procurement submissions, are concerned only with the lowest price and do not properly evaluate life cycle costs. So somebody may bid to supply an item or may bid to provide some form of construction, but using inferior materials or using materials that are difficult to maintain. And this now empowers procuring entities to look not just at price, but to look at quality and to look at the item over its life cycle, which only makes sense. That is quite commonplace in developed countries. So this now requires that life cycle costing methodology be used to establish the total cost of ownership, which results in the achievement of one of the core principles of the Act, which is value for money. And the easiest example I can think of that is machinery and equipment. Somebody may tender, they may be lowest bidder, but the equipment may not be durable, it may mash up within a couple of weeks, and therefore the entire exercise will be an exercise in futility. So this now requires procurement entities to not just look at the actual bid price, but also at the life cycle costs of the equipment. That's very, very important. There are so many items that have been procured in the public space that within a short period of time have to be put aside and cannot be used. And therefore, one must look at all elements of price. The ninth set of regulations is the miscellaneous regulations. This allows the board, through Section 16 of the Act, to appoint committees for providing advice on any matter within its functions. This sets out a transparent method of appointments to these types of committees. So we will know who is advising the Office of the Procurement Regulator, the board, under Regulation 3.2, by way of a public invitation in at least one newspaper of such proposed appointments. So the board or the Office of Procurement Regulation will not be able to appoint persons to advise it in secret. Regulations would also set out terms and conditions under which these members would operate. Section 63(2) of the Act stipulates that any contravention of the regulations made to give effect to the provisions of the Act could result in penalties being applied, and this even extends to committee members who may give the procurement regulator bad advice. And finally, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Procurement of Consultants regulations. This set of regulations, the 10th and last, outline the procurement methods by which consultants may be engaged. Procurement options for engaging consultants include utilizing sole source, where there's only one firm that has the necessary expertise and track record, single source, open tendering, or the use of pre-qualification or pre-selection lists, depending on the circumstances. These regulations also require consultants to submit a technical and financial proposal and outlines the evaluation methods that can be utilized based on the nature of the consultancy. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, conflicts of interest among consultants and in consultancy arrangements are not new, well known, that you have consultants who also have an interest in construction and therefore may give bad advice. And these regulations make it clear that where conflicts are found, the consultancy will be disqualified. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I have traversed the regulations. Do I have just a few more minutes? 6 minutes, thank you very much. I want to go back to the reason why we are here, and I want to just re-emphasize that when these regulations are passed by this Honorable House, which I expect they will be, and passed in the other place, which again I will seek to obtain the support of the other place. In fact, I must say that we've had quite substantive comments coming from a senator in the other place, which were very helpful to us, and we incorporated quite a few of them. When these regulations are passed in this place and in the other place, and we proclaim this act, and we deal with the other regulations, which are already drafted, by the way, I must say that. The regulations that don't require affirmative resolution have already been drafted and will be laid in Parliament in short order. When we do that, we are going to be involved in a paradigm shift from what occurs at this point in time, where although a state-owned enterprise is a public body, the court at this point in time has held, both in Trinidad and abroad, in the United Kingdom, in Australia in particular, in Canada, where a lot of the learning has come with respect to the amenability of contract awards by state enterprises to judicial review. The current paradigm is that the commercial decisions of state enterprises are not subject to judicial review unless a prima facie case of fraud, corruption, or bad faith can be established. I want to repeat that. At this time, the commercial decisions of state enterprises are not subject to judicial review in Trinidad and Tobago unless a prima facie case of fraud, corruption, or bad faith can be established. What this is going to do now is going to allow someone who feels that the persons who evaluated his bid did not give him the correct number of points or did not take into account all the features of his bid or his particular circumstances. This will now allow the Office of the Procurement Regulator to get involved and sit in the shoes of the evaluators of the tender committees in state enterprises. This is a very serious move that we are making here. It is something that the country has asked for, and it has taken a very long time. You would have realized, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I went through the summary of these regulations, because within the time permitted, that is all I could do. I could simply summarize the import, effect, and intent of the regulations. This is quite sophisticated. This is quite complex. It will lead to greater transparency. There's no two ways about that. And we shall see how it affects the pace of development in the country. We shall see whether it is indeed the panacea that it is held out to be. But I'm very pleased, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to have been able to get the requisite assistance from expert consultants, from persons in my ministry, from...
2 more minutes, member.
Yes, thank you. From the interventions, the comments, and the suggestions from the construction industry, and also other stakeholders. I'm very happy that we've been able to traverse this very complex path and get to the point where we are today, where I am able to debate these 10 sets of regulations and put us well on the way in the very near future to the full proclamation and implementation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act. And I beg to move, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Honourable members, I will now propose the question for debate. Be it resolved that the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings, Number 2, Regulations 2021 be approved. A note, honourable members, you are reminded that leave has been granted for motions numbers 1 to 10 to be debated together. I think I recognize the member for Oropuchis. And member for Oropuchis, you have 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I begin, of course, on this day by wishing your good self, all parliamentary colleagues, members of the administration, staff of the Parliament, including our security, very happy, prosperous, and very safe 2022. Mr. Deputy Speaker, indeed, this is an historic occasion that has been the subject of much anticipation, that we would debate 10 sets of regulations pursuant to the Procurement and the Procurement Act, the Public Procurement Act. It is, of course, as the Minister indicated, somewhat of a complex body of regulations that synchronize itself with the parent act, the Public Procurement Act. And therefore, it requires some understanding of the act, but also some understanding of the principles inherent in the parent act and the elements of public law, as the Minister indicated, inherent in the body of regulations. Like the Minister before me, I would also like to set the context for this debate from our perspective, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to indicate that those of us in the opposition, and particularly myself, I think the member for Siparia and a couple others, in a way we have shepherded the discussion, the public discussion, the parliamentary discussion, the parliamentary process dealing with public procurement. We have had the opportunity during our term in 2010 to 2014 to be au courant with the development of this law, and indeed by 2014 to be part of an historic parliament that passed the Parent Act. We have waited a long time, and therefore it is not a debate that we take lightly, given the complexity of the matters involved, given the depth of issues, given the practice of business, and while we will look at the complex issues in matters like this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we will try to understand the application, we must also stand in the shoes of those persons and those entities that would be affected by these regulations, whether it is the contractor, the supplier, whether it is a foreign entity, whether it is a lone operator, a sole operator offering goods and services to state enterprises and so on. They are the ones that would be impacted by these regulations, and therefore it is our duty to explain in as simple terms as we can the implementation and the operationalization of these regulations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I begin with the end of an editorial in The Guardian of Friday, 14, 2022 today. The title of the editorial of The Guardian today is Public Procurement in Limbo. And of course, it is not my desire to read the entire editorial, which is a very pertinent and relevant editorial given what we are doing this afternoon. But it ends with an interesting comment following, and I quote, "Following today's sitting of Parliament, the final hurdle in the way of full implementation will be crossed, hopefully." The Minister, on not one but on two occasions, indicated the importance of these measures as to the full proclamation of the legislation. But at no time did the Minister venture to tell us when we would find the full implementation of this legislation. So that the newspaper stating, hopefully, following today's sitting of Parliament, the final hurdle in the way of full implementation will be crossed. I will indicate to the editor, don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. Mr. Deputy Speaker, today we are dealing with several areas, and just to recap it fully, we're dealing with the areas concerning record of proceedings, challenge proceedings, ineligibility proceedings, retention and disposal, evaluation, participation, pre-qualification and pre-selection, procurement methods and procedure, and procurement of consultants, which the Minister dealt with at the end of his presentation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to alert you that several of my colleagues are able and willing to participate in this debate, and we would indeed speak to all these areas, but certain colleagues, of course, would concentrate on one area or the other. I intend to speak, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the area of consultants and participation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, by way of introduction, these procurement regulations were forwarded to the Minister of Finance in and around November 30th, 2018, 3 years ago. The Minister admitted that he did receive 48 or 43 pages of recommendations 3 years ago. The procurement regulator was appointed in January 2018, which means he wasted little time in getting to work on these matters to operationalize the Act. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the 6th report of the Joint Select Committee Finance and Legal Affairs Inquiry into the implementation of the new procurement system and the 4th session of the 2018-2019 year of the 11th Parliament had this to say: during the period July 5, 2018 to August 2018, a consultant was engaged with the assistance of the IADB to conduct an analysis of the legal framework and drafting of the procurement regulations. These regulations were sent to the Ministry of Finance on November 30, 2018, pursuant to Section 63 of the Act, which the Minister identified, and was scheduled to undergo parliamentary consideration by February 2019. It is to be appreciated, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the regulations produced by the regulator and his team were generally comprehensive and detailed, and for that, the regulator should be seen as separate and apart from the Minister of Finance in this debate. While it may be that the regulations submitted in 2018 were the subject of review and senior counsel's advice on the invitation of the Minister, as he indicated, amended regulations were submitted by the Office of Procurement Regulator since the 3rd of March 2019. That is a matter, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of public record. In the 2019 national budget, the Minister of Finance declared that the Act would be fully proclaimed by March 2019. And I go back to the point I made earlier, that today, with the regulations in hand and on the verge of passage, as the Minister claimed, we still do not have a date on which this piece of legislation will be fully proclaimed. This has been the song and dance of the Minister of Finance for every budget. In a release on the 14th of January 2019, Trinidad Express, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister of Finance stated, and I quote, January 2019, the regulations are therefore not a trivial matter and must be subjected to thorough and rational examination by the Ministry of Finance. In the Express of the 19th of September 2019, the procurement regulator stated that the Office of Procurement Regulator has gone through pains to draft all the regulations and complete the handbooks that prescribe how public bodies and state bodies should contract goods and services and dispose of public property. Mr. Lalchan, I believe, said his office submitted all remaining documents to the Minister of Finance on September 2nd, 2019. He was hopeful that the stated intentions of the Prime Minister and the government to have the regulation passed by December 2019 will become a reality. Well, he was wrong. Today, this government has brought the regulations to debate on the floor January 2022. That, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the beginning of our position today, that the delay has been, we believe, planned, intentional. It was not a delay due to accident, due to COVID, although they may argue that COVID may have influenced this as well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a couple days ago, I believe it was on Wednesday last, I had the displeasure of witnessing a live, on my computer, a live session proceedings of the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday 12th, a couple days ago. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, like the rest of the national community, I stood there in shock, looking on at this, when we were told on that public televised broadcast of the Public Accounts Committee that of the 314 agencies that the OPR expected to respond to their query about the state of readiness to implement the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, only 70 responded. So on the matter of implementation of these regulations, 10 set of regulations before us today, all synchronizing with aspects of the Act, we are told 48 hours ago that 70 responded out of 314 agencies approached. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister may want to tell us something about this. If 70 responded, and we are not sure which is the 70 at this time, what is the state of readiness of the state sector to implement the regulations that we have before us today? That is the first thing. So it may take another 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. When? You would have thought, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that given the time that would have passed between 2014 to 2022, state enterprises would have been putting their house in order and be eager and excited to respond to a Public Accounts Committee through the OPR that they were in a state of readiness, that they had put systems and institutions in place. But 70 out of 318 indicated, and they responded. That doesn't mean that they are in a state of readiness. It means they responded. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Lalchan, Mr. Moonilal Lalchan, and let me say from the beginning, no relation at all between myself and the goodly gentleman. In fact, I will suffer in comparison with him. Indicated that this organization, this institution, was still a toothless dog, was still toothless in dealing with the issues of the day. So the regulations, if approved today, there will be no rush to implement because they cannot implement by virtue of not having codes of conduct, not having audits and so on in place, which are requirements of the Act. This will further delay the benefit of having the regulations in place.
It will further delay that. They advised that they were not in any position to ensure compliance because the regulations were not in place. And 70 responded out of 314. Their program of activities were not synchronized with the implementation of the Act itself. So that it suggests that the Minister of Finance may have failed, and his collaborators, to put in place the requisite processes, programs, initiatives to protect the public purse, to ensure transparency and accountability for the procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. The Ministry of Finance has not acted to ensure that these agencies even comply with requests from the Office of Procurement Regulator. They could not even comply with a request. So they are not anxious to account. Of the 314 agencies that these regulations now will apply to, 20 had a code of conduct. The rest did not or did not respond. 20 out of 314. So that despite the passage of these the legislation, the regulator has been forced to operate under the confines of the Central Tenders Board Act for the last 6 years. It means the CTB legislation was recognized as weak and deficient in multiple areas, but continues in place. So having recognized the deficiencies and put legislation to address them, it is highly suspicious that the minister appears today to suggest that having passed these legislations, we'll be any closer to implementing and proclaiming the Public Procurement Act. And that, I think, is a naked truth that we must confront immediately. We want to go on record to indicate that the Office of Procurement Regulator has done a good job in providing substantial amount of preparatory work, but this will come to naught because of the disregard of the vast majority of state enterprises. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wanted to throw on the table earlier o'clock the recommendation that we should probably be thinking not only of institutional advancement by way of the law before us and the regulations, but within the management of the government itself. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to get to some of the issues raised by the Minister in terms of the various areas of the regulations that the Minister outlined. Incidentally, the Minister indicated that he did procure the services of an attorney to advise him on the regulations, but did not indicate the identity of the attorney that he procured, the identity of the consultants. He did not indicate that, but spent some time telling us about the position as it relates to the court in using the two cases, Pancrete and NH International, to suggest that the issue of inefficient elements of public law was a critical issue that the regulations are now addressing, and went on to deal with that. And there are limited principles under which you can access the court to overturn a decision of a procuring entity. We have also learned, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the regulations, broken up as they are, also specify issues of local content, of building contractor and supplier database, and having those databases, so to speak, accessible as well and updated through a process that will allow for the Office of Procurement Regulator to be on top of the issues as it relates to accessing contracts, accessing state facilities for the supply of goods and services. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, it comes back to the root point. If today 70 out of 314 procurement entities responded, to what extent could we expect them to be developing in-house databases of suppliers and contractors, and updating on technical and financial information of suppliers and contractors? To what extent? So I think we are hoping and over-hoping that this matter could resolve itself, bearing in mind that the entities themselves are nowhere close to implementing the procurement legislation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, notwithstanding their promises in manifesto after manifesto in 2015 and thereon that they will implement this, in 2015 in particular. Today, 7 years later, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are no close to implementing, notwithstanding the delayed arrival of the regulations on the floor of the Parliament for debate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this country has had an amazing history of improper procurement. And I just wanted to remind ourselves that notwithstanding the laudable ideals of procurement legislation, the time it takes and the issues associated with it. I recall, because Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've been around sometime, where this country spent over $230 million on something called Project Pride, which was to begin construction of a new airport in the 1995-2000 period, somewhere there. We were looking at that. And between 91 to 95, $230 million on Project Pride. We had here procuring of consultancy services, and I'll get to consultancy services because that is where I want to sort of drill down on. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have had consultancy services for the development of a monorail. And few people may know that that monorail project cost, I believe, around $1 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. The Rapid Rail. And Mr. Speaker, the Rapid Rail, later called the Rapid Racket, was an engineering project of $1 billion.
Honorable Member,
yeah,
please. You did the correct thing first, but then you came back and you did something else. Let's retract the word, please.
Okay, please. I will call it the Rapid Rail Report. Yes, thank you. The Rapid Rail Report, procured at a cost of $1 billion, was later used as a footstool by one Minister of Works because that project was completely abandoned. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a cricket stadium here started at $365 million, ended up at $1.3 billion. They still to this day cannot host an international cricket match. That is a FET-match stadium, $1.3 billion. Because one of the matters that have affected us in procurement of contracts and transparency and integrity and credibility of contracts has been the matter of cost overruns. When, through a process, you deliberately put in costs and so on in a way to attract the favoritism, to attract a positive and favorable outcome from a selection panel, and you later pack costs as you go along and call it cost overruns, which cabinets approve. And that has been a serious problem that we have faced over the years. Now, you can easily find other projects, and not only other projects, but other governments having similar challenges. So I want to make the point in this way, is that this is not when I raise these issues, it's not a specific government. All governments over the years have had these challenges because of the failure to have procurement legislation in place, because of the failure to develop the law because we have failed to implement the regulations and the law. In 2014, between 2010 and 2014, I believe that was the speediest time that was used by a parliament to arrive at procurement legislation, passed in 2014 under the Prime Ministership of the member for Siparia. And 2014 to 2022, January 2022, we are now discussing regulations. Not the bill, not the act. In fact, the act was amended several times, and the purpose of amending that act was really to remove certain areas from transparency. So you had a bill passed 2014 as an act, and every time we came to look at the bill, it was to reduce transparency, not to increase it. Legal services, medical services, government-to-government agreements, public-private sector agreements. So every time we came to amend the procurement law, it was to water down the procurement law. Today we come with the regulations, and I will get into this matter immediately. We are here talking about consultants, and if I can just reflect quickly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on this area dealing with consultants. Yes, regulations number 2, 2021, and there's a certain arrangement here, and again for the record, let me state, procurement of consultants, competitive process for selecting a consultant, selection of consultants from among public bodies, shortlisting, requests for proposals, submissions, and so on. Mr. Speaker, when you plow through this, of course, It defines what is a consultant, market knowledge, and so on. But at Section 3, you have here procurement of consultants. And, the minister indicated he procured a consultant lawyer. Now, where did this happen? How did this happen? Was there a public tender? Was it from a pre-selected list at the Ministry of Finance? Was it because it's a specialized area and only one person and one person alone could have satisfied that? And Mr. Deputy Speaker, it says here, the procuring entity may utilize either the sole source or single source method of procurement, where a consultant is to be selected because of his specialized qualification. And B, it is necessary for a consultant to continue a project where the initial contract of award through an approved procurement process in compliance with the Act and in compliance with the regulation. It is the regulations before us now, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It goes on at Clause 4, a procuring entity may invite proposals via open tendering or from a listing of pre-qualified or pre-selected consultants. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the most dramatic procurement of a consultant advisor to this government was the procurement of a lobbyist in Washington by the name of Arthur Collins. We lost count when he got $20 million. I think we lost count of how much more was involved. Every time we came to the parliament, we heard that his contract was extended. In fact, we have never heard that the contract ended. Now, when you have governments operating like this, taking on board lobbyists in Washington to promote the interests of Trinidad and Tobago, I ask the question, so what was the purpose of the mission there? Was this somebody selected through a single source, through a sole tendering process? Was there some advertisement in the social media or the newspapers in Washington and elsewhere around the world to source a firm to help Trinidad and Tobago identify what was the problem, what you needed? No. We were told in this parliament by the Prime Minister, I knew him. I think he's good at the job. I hire him. That is procurement. I knew him. I thought he good. I hire him. That is the procurement process. So you have here regulations on consultants, but you proceed in a particular way. You proceed in a particular way to appoint consultants outside of these regulations. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, we submit that there was a purpose in taking 7 years and maybe another 7 years before implementing this. Because had these regulations been in place, Art Collins may not have been in place. That is the truth of the matter. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's a process through recruiting agencies, and incidentally, I believe a ministry is a recruiting agency. Divisions of a ministry, state enterprises, so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, would have procured the services of lobbyists wherever he is in the world. But they would not have used any transparent method because we were told that we know him, we like him, we hire him. Procurement policy. And this is why, Mr. Deputy Speaker, those of us on this side are very concerned with this matter before us as to the timeline it would take. And if it is that the Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, who carries a legacy name, would be responding, he would want to tell us, when are we going to proclaim and implement this fully? When would these regulations be implemented if 70 out of 314 entities just replied? That, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the burning question. Mr. Deputy Speaker, last year I made a loud noise, which members on the opposite side did not like, when I raised the issue of the procurement of goods by the government in a matter that was shrouded in secrecy. I will not use other words to suggest it was nefarious, it was, fraudulent and so on, but certainly secret. Not other thing. It was certainly secret. And when we raised the issue of the procurement in and around September 2019 of CCTV cameras at the Ministry of National Security, I was told I have an obsession with CCTV cameras. Because a process started where persons made their bidding, and then it was undone. It was just cancelled with no reason given. And then from September 2019 to January 2020, we were told through the persons in the sector who were bidding that they went and split up that job into two and invited, in some way that nobody knew, invited prospective suppliers of hardware. And then split it for a software maintenance to be with someone else. But at no time, even today, there are pending questions to the Ministry of National Security on this. And they refuse flatly to answer questions on the procurement of CCTV camera and associated services. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is just an example of procurement and of consultancies that can be procured properly if and when such regulations come into being. The other matter, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, today, is an ongoing matter, I know, but we are hearing so much and we accept so much because we live in the COVID pandemic. And when you're in a COVID pandemic, a pandemic like this, you accept things without questioning because everything you seem to believe is in the interest of public health. So sometimes if you have a question, you don't want to ask it because you're public health. There's the procurement of vaccines. And all of these arrangements are now non-disclosure arrangements. Every time you ask anything about the expenditure of public funds, it is non-disclosure agreement, non-disclosure this, non-disclosure this. So what is disclosure? What will we ever disclose if everything is non-disclosure, in which millions of dollars are being spent? Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Minister spoke about procurement entities, and he actually identified NIDCO and UDICOT as two key procurement entities, and clearly those entities, there are some entities that are much bigger than the others. NIDCO clearly, UDICOT as well, that procure goods and services. The PO program, for example, that procure construction services and so on. And they are now asked to develop, according to these regulations, an infrastructure, an institutional infrastructure to manage in a transparent way the provision of goods and services. These entities. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to remind the National Committee that the UDICOT was the subject of a commission of inquiry on the matter of procurement in 2009, 2010, around there. UDICOT itself, that presided over the cricket stadium, was the subject of an inquiry. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there will be little hope in these matters if the entities that are involved are not up to scratch and are not committed philosophically and are not committed to abide by the law, to implement the institutions that are required by the law and the regulations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the issue of high-value procurement was raised by the Minister as well. High-value procurement, and we have something of a working definition of that, because those are things that you will hardly find suppliers, you will hardly find providers of those services, you will hardly find providers of those goods, because they call high-value procurement processes and so on. And you may be in a position where you don't have an established pre-qualification list. So you have to secure goods and services within another context. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just like the CCTV camera before, you could be operating as well in an area where we lack transparency, integrity, where there's little or no public information on how you conduct business. And this is why, for example, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we even suggest that the Joint Select Committee of Parliament on National Security and other committees can be empowered to explore issues of transparency and procurement in camera, if you so prefer, that they are sensitive national security matters and so on. They should be able to investigate these matters. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a bulk of expenditure on consultancy fees at the higher scale would be large-scale projects. Large-scale projects. Now, when we talk of consultants, competitive processes, selection of consultants, I would go to evaluation methods now, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We must get out of our mind that this is dealing only with lower-level, low-cost consultancies for legal services, although that may be excluded now. But in large-scale projects, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as much as 40% of a cost of a project could be in the way of consultancies one way or another, because it's an ongoing matter. Consultants are hired for a project and it's ongoing for the life of specific contracts. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the evaluation methods that we are now putting into the regulations must work in tandem with the requisite area clause in the Parent Act. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we would like to ask the government to respond as to whether or not the two biggest agencies that deals with procurement of consultants, UDICOT and NIDCO, have submitted their proposals, their strategies, their plans, their institutional arrangements to the Office of Procurement Regulator. Because they are the ones that will deal with the multi-billion-dollar contracts, and by definition, the billion-dollar consultancies. They are the ones. It is not the small at the lower level of procuring for small-scale construction work and small-scale provision of goods and services and so on. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the issue of conflict of interest arise. Now, this government is a government that clearly have now come to epitomize and to personalize the issue of recusals. And, you know, this has serious, serious implications because in the whole constitutional arrangements of this country, I don't think that people foresaw, drafters foresaw that it would have cabinet ministers at any time who will have to recuse themselves 52 times in 1 year from decisions of the cabinet. Maybe it is because that level of businessmen and entrepreneurs and other business heads may not have been in the cabinet. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, through a process, we received information on recusals and so on, and suggesting conflict of interest, because the issue of the procurement entity not awarding a procurement contract to consultants and so on, where conflict of interest arises, is really the issue of recusing as well. And the government has now developed this habit of two things, of having no problem with ministers in office that recuse themselves with monotonous frequency over several matters, including matters of their own ministry. So a minister brings a note to cabinet and that's, I have to leave the cabinet room because I think I'm conflicted. Who brought the note? Then, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I heard the other day the Prime Minister boasting about running a private business and earning money. I knew that ministers cannot earn money outside of their ministerial salaries, including a Prime Minister. And I was shocked that nobody said anything. Nobody cared. Maybe didn't believe him, that he was actually earning something. But nobody cared that in a government, the head of the government can boast about earning money outside of the public purse. And on a related matter of procurement of consultants, I want to make another issue, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and ask the question, under what circumstances do consultants work free for a government? This is something we are now hearing about as well as part of the usual operations of government. When we stood in the Parliament and asked the questions as to the recruitment and procurement of two retired officers, one from the police and one from the Defence Force, to conduct an inquiry into firearms distribution and so on, we were told by the head of government that they're working for free. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a saying, there is no free lunch. There's no free breakfast and dinner either. But there's no free lunch. Something is intrinsically wrong with persons working for the government for free in that way, because they may look for a favor lower down the road. They may look for a favor that they may look to repay a favor that they got before. So if someone hypothetically, and none of the characters I'm naming are alive or real, they are fictitious. Hypothetically, if someone is given an HDC home, and then 6 months or 1 year later you ask them to do something for free for the government, they have been a recipient of something before of the administration. They may actually get something later down the road for doing the free work. So it is not correct when you're recruiting consultants, procuring the consultants. It is incorrect, it is wrong, I believe, in principle, for persons to be offering themselves free to the government like this. Surely you have a stipend or you have some small fee or something. You can reduce your professional costs and so on. If you are technically trained, you reduce your costs and so on. But a government ought not to be looking at just hiring people, pulling them from the street, no process at all, and saying, well, you're working for free. It cannot work like that, and taking serious decisions that undermine public officers. And that is something I also raise in the context of transparency with the procurement of consultancy services. That is a serious issue I raise. Now, you will look at that and maybe the respondent to me will say, well, we want everybody must earn money and earn large fees and so on. No, 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 no. There must be a process, a principle where persons are consultants, they work for the government, their credibility, integrity is at stake, and they receive, even if a small stipend, even if a small professional fee. But you ought not to have people to say working for the government free. As was declared in this House, it is on Hansard, as declared in this House, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I raise this issue of the disposal of property now, which is a fundamental part of the regulations, the disposal of property, in the context that the government has embarked on a process well known to all, on identifying a process. The process is not known, but the identification of an objective is known, of privatizing, selling, leasing the refinery assets. Nothing has come of that. We now have Olion at Pointe-à-Pierre, which eventually scrap dealers will be bidding for. Years after there was a promise, this very minister stood up in this parliament, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and banged the table with joy, saying that we are so happy a local entity, patriotic, will take command of the refinery, and the opposition don't like that. He banged the table. I think they had to repair the table when he was finished. Today, 3 years later, they cannot procure, they cannot dispose of that element of public property through any transparent measure. Every time you ask, what is happening with that? We are in the process, we are looking, we are tendering, it is an ongoing process. And Olion packing up in Pointe-à-Pierre, that eventually will go to a scrapyard. This is the legacy of the disposal of public property that this government presides over. Now, I know that they will want to come after and talk about the People's Partnership Administration and the Beetham Wastewater and the EMBDC and all that kind of thing. And let me tell you something, the more you talk about that is the more elections you will lose. I am sure they will come with that, they will come with that. But that didn't help them before, it will not help them now. Because those matters, of course I don't want to get into those matters, and I deliberately didn't raise matters involving the EMBDC, HDC, because they're matters at court, in the civil court. The government has put case in court, so the approach is to put a case in court, taxpayers pay lawyers. That is the approach. And I hope that they will not be raising those issues that are before the court. So I just warn you of that, because I did not do it. But the Beetham wastewater issue is not the procurement of a contractor to undertake a Beetham wastewater plant is not before the court. It's not. So I can address that briefly. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, having this government plunder and, attack the opposition for years now about this matter in terms of the contract and the procurement of the... Oh, there's a standing order, sorry.
48.6, the use of the word plundered.
Okay, I will change the word because I really don't at this stage don't want to entertain
proceed now. Renasi, as you desire change the word, please.
Yes, the government did not plunder on that matter. No, they attacked the opposition.
6 again.
Okay, so again, member.
Okay, I withdraw the word plunder.
Lovely.
Okay. The government was very critical of the opposition. I think we could go with the word critical.
And smart with foolishness.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, you either have a standing order. What you doing? You're judging in a debate?
Mr. Deputy Speaker.
48.1.
I recognize the leader of the House, member. Hold on.
48.6 again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because even as the member is withdrawing, he's repeating the word.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I withdraw the word plunder, and I've gone past that.
Member, please, wait. All right, member, so according to 48.6, I would like you to withdraw. Let's kindly withdraw and move on.
Mr. Speaker, I kindly withdraw, and let me move on. The point I'm making, and I pray now that there's no objection, is that this government has been, over the years, critical of the partnership government as it relates to an issue of the Beetham wastewater plant. I think we can safely say that. On that matter of procurement, there is a hidden report at the NGC that deals with that project, indicating that the project was well worth its while, that project could have brought relief in terms of the supply of water to residential areas by transforming the water that was there now to the industrial estates. 20 million gallons per day. And there were bidders, there was a procurement issue there. The NGC went out and invited bidders to submit bids to continue that project because they had gone into some arrangements with the former contractor. And there were bidders. And when the bidders came in and expressed deep interest in that project, on the viability of the project, a procuring entity named NGC canceled everything on instructions from ministers because it would not look good if the Beetham wastewater project was completed. It means the partnership was onto a good thing. And that is where we are with procurement. So 20 million gallons a day. People don't have water in this country. You could not divert 20 million gallons to industrial estate and allow residents to have 20 million gallons of water a day because of your malice.
Remember, you have 2 more minutes.
How much?
2 more minutes.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy Speaker, well, in winding up in that 2 minutes or so, let me say that the conflict of interest matter we dealt with, the consultants matter we dealt with. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is also well known that these matters would in some way influence the operations of the construction industry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the construction industry is not a homogeneous sector. Indeed, there are several elements in that industry, including transport, of course, that will be impacted and affected by this. I would like to call on the government as a recommendation in closing to have greater interfacing, greater awareness and education with the various subsectors in the construction industry to appraise them of the requirements of the regulations now, because I think persons are aware somewhat of the Parent Act, but the requirements of the legislation, not to consult as to change regulations, but really to make awareness and education as to what is required if and when these regulations are eventually implemented. Because you see, in the construction sector, not everybody suffers the same. Certain costs and certain processes that a large-scale contractor can undertake, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a small contractor finds it difficult. And therefore, the awareness is very important because this means increase in costs for small-scale operators in the sector. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are other speakers who will appear after me and deal with specific areas. We wanted in opening just to indicate our general feelings on the matter, to indicate that it is very important. The United National Congress and the partnership government today has the historic duty, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to participate in this matter, since it was our administration that introduced into Parliament and passed the Procurement of Procurement and Public Property Act 2014. Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you.
I recognize the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West. Member, on entering the debate, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and allow me to thank my colleagues for allowing me to enter the debate a little earlier than expected. At the outset, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reason for that is as I sat there listening to the previous speaker, the member for Urupuchi East, I had to leave the chamber because my stomach started to churn. Because the audacity with which the member for Urupuchi East came in his normal flamboyant style to attempt to put forward facts to the population through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it became critical and important that I immediately seek the leave of my colleague to respond to the member for Oropouche East, lest we leave any of that attempt to rewrite history on the books unattended to. So let me say first of all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is a little bewildering to listen to some of the examples given with respect to improper procurement or a suggestion by the former member, the former speaker, as to what is improper procurement. Let's start with some live examples in response. And the one that I picked up the back end of, coming to the end, and I was a little stunned, so I actually had to stop, pause, turn up the volume to hear if he was really referring, the member for Oropouche East, to the Beetham wastewater project. So I was in an office and the volume was turned up. And when I heard the member try to put a spin on that now and change and rewrite and liquid paper of history, allow me through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to remind the population of the irrefutable facts with respect to the Beetham wastewater plant. Because you see, it was a PNM opposition in 2014 to 2015 that first alerted the population to the abuse of procurement that was about to take place with the award of the Beetham wastewater project. In fact, my recollection was that a PNM opposition that came to the Parliament to attempt to raise it, saw it so important to prevent the wastage of over $1 billion in cash, $1 billion in cash. Because you see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the ways utilized in that period to get around not only proper procurement, because procurement is only part of the puzzle. Let us not fool ourselves. The other piece of the puzzle is that after a contract is awarded, the management of it. And when you borrow money and you have agencies who are interested how their money is being spent, for example, the IDB or a bank, what they will do is they will appoint quantity surveyors to oversee the work to make sure that prior to money being paid, there is some quantity surveyor or some engineer who looks to make sure that the work being paid for has actually been done. So let's start with the Beetham wastewater project that the member for Oropouche East cherry-picked as one to give an example and to try and spin it once again on NGC and how NGC didn't, when there were other persons interested in finishing this project at $300 million, NGC was instructed by ministers to stop and not spend taxpayers $300. That is not even accepted. The Beetham wastewater project was awarded to a company called SIS by NGC. First question for the people of Trinidad and Tobago: why did a UNC government use NGC, National Gas Company, to deal with a wastewater treatment plant? Was it because there was a pot of cash at NGC that they didn't need anybody to oversee, as ministers and others gave instructions as to how to award the contract? First point. Second point, the bid that was put in by SIS, who have absolutely no experience in building a wastewater plant, was $400 million over the value of what the plant should have been. So out of $1 billion awarded, it was $400 million at the outset over value. And you come here today to talk about $300 million to finish it? Then let the population of Trinidad be reminded at the end, thankfully, in 2015, when the population elected a PNM government and we came in, what was it that SIS, who was in Piarco Airport on his way to Panama, where there's no extradition treaty, what was he saying? The reason to terminate the contract was because the then leader of opposition and the minister from Diego Martin West and the member for Diego Martin Northeast talked about him on a platform. So he can't finish the project because he's not worried. So we come in and we do an assessment in a proper way. You want to talk about consultants, etc. We came in, quantity surveyors were brought in, experts were brought in. And you know what they came up with when they went in and they checked the documentation? Over 80% of the $1 billion, so over $800 million in cash spent, how much work done? Less than 40%. Let the people of Trinidad and Tobago know that is UNC procurement, UNC carrying out of contract, and UNC expenditure of their tax-paying dollars with no protection. So on that one project, overpriced by $400 million, over $800 million of NGC's cash paid out. So it's difficult now, sometimes as the Minister of Energy, to sit here and listen to them attack NGC, which was left without any cash at the end of their tenure, and now put in a period where there's a lot of work to be done. If we had the $16 billion that they went spending all over, and the other one, the advertising campaign, again, consultants, I wonder what was the selective process for that? Happiness. Who in 2015 remembers waking up every morning, opening your newspaper to full-page spreads of happiness by NGC and the payment of one of their favorite PR consultants? So don't come here now today to talk about delay in procurement legislation, because I recall debating this procurement legislation as they tried at the last minute to pull the wool on the population in 2014, 2015 as a temporary opposition senator and raising concerns about the procurement legislation then. Nothing was procured, nothing was done. Nothing was proclaimed. You talk about beat 'em. Let me give another good example of proper procurement, UNC style, the QREP interchange. What do we as a population know about the QREP interchange? They put it out. One contractor selected. It leads to a fight in a cabinet between two ministers. One minister fired because she shouldn't have raised any questions about who they were awarding this contract to for $500 million. Three contractors then upset because how he could get it and the two of us can't get any piece. What was the response to that in procurement? What was the response to that by regulator? And every nice word they want to use, split it in three. All of we go share in peace. So one contractor was to get the road leading up to QREP, another contractor to get the piece going over the highway, and the third contractor, well, you take the piece going south now. And what happened with that attempt? It came up to over 500 million. So they couldn't stomach over 500 million. Again, thankfully, along roll September 2015, a PNM administration comes in, scraps all of that, and we go out for competitive tender. Because you see, I want to make the point, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This legislation is not going to be the solution to everything. In fact, some believe, including myself, it may create problems in other areas. But the population has called for it, we're going for it, the regulations are here to be debated today. But let's finish the QREP interchange story. Remember the story, 500 million, split it three ways amongst three contractors, but then when they put in their bids for those three pieces, the whole thing was supposed to cost 500 under them. It went up above 5, they say no. Let's press pause because of course elections rolling around. We come in, competitive tender, and for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, that QREP interchange was built at $219 million. Savings without the procurement legislation. Because you see, it is how you conduct your business. It is how you transact the business of your house. It is how you look after the people's money. Again, I listened to the member for Oropuch East, and what came to mind? Put your mind back to just around before the election. EMBD. So EMBD, they go out, they borrow over $400 million to fix roads. Where's the procurement? They invite selected contractors. What happens? 5 contractors split up all the contracts. Money all paid out, over $400 million. This procurement, this is what we're talking about. Over $400 million paid out. What happens? When we come in, we assess the work not done.
Deputy Speaker, I think that matter is sub judice. It's in the court. And the minister knows that. 49. A determination.
You have a determination on where it's at?
49. No, it's 40. It's in the court, Deputy Speaker, so it's sub judice.
Remember, I'll give you a little leeway, and then.
Thank you. Yes, I heard one of them ball out on the other side. I put it in court.
No, member. Please, let's retract that statement. One of them, please.
The member for Barataria Sawa just shouted out, I put it in court. Yes, I am happy to have overseen the work that again has saved taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, and as a result of that have certain people before the court, and a judge ruled that there's a case to answer. I haven't breached any sub judice.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, Standing Order 49, the member even admitted that there's a ruling in this matter already on a preliminary point.
Brother Sanwan, I will entertain you in your proper seat, please. Once you are addressing the chair, I would like you in your proper seat. Proceed.
Thank you very much. So yes, I expect that kind of nervousness there. Right? Another one, because you see it's important that the people put into context as we come here to debate today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, have an understanding of some of the ills we're trying to fix. But the point is, even with the regulations, even with the legislation, even now that you put a proper structure in place to try and improve procurement, it is not going to solve everything, because there is a stage after the award of the contract. And that is one of the points that I'm making here today through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. After the award of the contract, how do you carry it out? So we heard about cost overruns. We heard about Rapid Rail Cricket Stadium. But these are some of the points. The Chaguaramas Broadwalk, Eden Gardens. Would these regulations have helped in Eden Gardens? Who was the Minister of Housing at the time that took the cabinet note to Eden Gardens to have the taxpayers pay $175 million for a $50 million property? And where did that extra $125 million go? So don't come here today and fight about how you choose a consultant and talk about Art Collins. One day we will tell the story of Mr. Art Collins and how the member for Oropuch East has a personal knowledge of Mr. Art Collins and the room that he sat down in with Mr. Art Collins.
Speaker, 48-6.
What is the 48-6? Because you sit down in a room?
Hold on, one. Honorable members, again, we are still early in the debate, all right? And I believe that the member is responding based on what has been entered into the debate at this time. So again...
Thank you very much. It is a direct response. I didn't see Mr. Art Collins' name in any paper before us. The member for Oropuch East had the gall to go into the booth again and raise Mr. Art Collins, who is not here to defend himself. What is the improper motive that you were sitting in a room with Mr. Art Collins at a particular time? I haven't said what you said in the room, because that might expose an improper motive. Right? Let's get now to this other one that he likes. The member for Oropuch East loves to talk about procurement of CCTV camera at national security. So I'm responding to that. Because yes, I've said it and I'll repeat it again today. He's obsessed with it. But I've now figured out why. I now understand why he has an obsession with the maintenance of those cameras and where the information comes from. So let me put it again on the record for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. This PNM administration went out for a tender on CCTV cameras. When it came down, there were attempts to frustrate the tendering process, the procurement process. But in the end, we prevailed and saved the taxpayers over $300 million. And you see, I listened carefully for the member for Oropuch East. Today, He said about breaking up the contract, one for equipment, one for this, one for maintenance. And from the time I heard maintenance, my ears perked up, because that for me was a confirmation of what his continuous utterances about it are. Because yes, there were contracts for maintenance. And you see, when you break up these types of things that are improperly procured in the first place, you rustle the pockets of some. And those some who are no longer able to feed off of the taxpayer go running for a mouthpiece. But at the right time, it will all come out. At the right time, because there is nothing wrong, and I'm telling the people of Trinidad and Tobago without fear of contradiction, despite the attempts of persons to frustrate that tender process,
each one will have the opportunity to enter the debate. No shouting or utterances audibly enough across the chamber. Proceed.
Thank you very much.
Members, I'm on my feet. You have roughly just about 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Thank you very much. So I want to assure the people of Trinidad and Tobago on that CCTV contract. First of all, there's another one that constantly likes to ask, what is the status of the camera? Over 85%, if not 90%, of all the cameras are currently working. That contract that people try to frustrate, there was actually a police investigation. I wrote as the Minister of National Security to the Commissioner of Police asking for a police investigation into that procurement process, because there were persons who tried to make files go missing to ensure that there was not a proper award of contract. But you see, you must listen carefully. And those who make the most noise, there's two things you learn. Empty barrels make the most noise, but then there's another saying, when stone pelting, he who ball in, watch them. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it was important to be allowed the opportunity to come in and to enter the debate to directly respond to some of the utterances from the previous speaker. The other speakers for this side who will follow, I am certain, will pick up where we should be, which is a proper intellectual conversation with respect to the regulations that are before us, which is what I was preparing to come to deal with today. But when I heard the barrel making the noise, it was important to respond. The member for Oropuch East. I retract it. Sorry, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The barrel is, the reference the barrel is retracted in full. Member, I retract the statement in full. And I appreciate the opportunity to be allowed to properly correct the record, to put onto the Hansard here this afternoon, procurement the UNC way. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Barataria Sanwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Remember, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to enter into this debate. And I also would like to take this opportunity to wish my colleagues on both sides of this House, the staff of the Parliament, a Happy New Year and all the best for 2022. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, as you think that we enter into a new year, persons may have resolutions to change the way in which they behave. But it seems as though the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, cannot change the way he is. Not a single regulation he has quoted in his entire 20 minutes. Not a single regulation. And in fact, we have 10 pieces of regulations. 10. And not a single one he bothered to quote, just to come here and cause bacchanal and lacquery in this place. The member didn't even bother to say how these regulations or defend the regulations, how they are going to improve the manner in which procurement will take place via state agencies. He couldn't give us a commitment to tell us when these regulations will come into force, or will the entire act be fully proclaimed and operationalized. Not a mention of that, but come to talk about things and stories, as he termed them, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago.
You see, the member for Port of Spain, North, St. Anne's West, had no confidence in his own colleague, the member for San Fernando East, to respond to the member for Oropochi East. That is why he stood up to respond. Because they were afraid that we talk about what took place with Udicott and a fella called Colm in this country. They want us to remove that from the history books of Trinidad and Tobago, but I am compelled after that contribution by the Minister of Energy to remind the country of the billions that went missing under the former Prime Minister, Mr. Manning, and Udicott, and Mr. Colm. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had church building in Guanapo. We had people called PM in this country. I didn't even know if it was the Prime Minister or the project manager. Mr. Deputy Speaker, he speaks of the Beetham wastewater plant. Today, people in this country cannot get water. Had that plant been operationalized, there would have been an additional 20 million gallons of water in this country. 20 million gallons. And it is so hypocritical for the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West to come here to talk about corruption and to talk about conflicts of interest when he had to recuse himself over 50 times from the cabinet because his family member was the beneficiary of
48.1 and 48.6 on this particular point, the last contribution made by the honourable member.
I need no assistance. Need no assistance whatsoever. Right. So again, Honorable AG, overruled at this time, but again, I need to make a statement at this time. Yes, we have 10 regulation guidelines before us. Right, members? So please, consider it and let's proceed.
Thank you.
Move on.
And then, you see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the member for Port of Spain South, Port of Spain North, gave several stories, and he talked about Beetham wastewater, he talked about EMBDs. He spoke of several matters, Curup interchange. Which one of those matters are currently in a criminal court in Trinidad and Tobago? Which one of those have been arrested or charged? The member for Oropochi East can sleep well at night. None of his family members are charged. I don't know if the same for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West. You see,
me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have no problems with references to issues, but an ad hominem debate on Port of Spain North is brought by way of a substantive motion. That is the simple point I'm making on 48.1.
Member for Caroni Central, I said I need no assistance in handling the portfolio here. Please, that's the second time. Right. Again, Baratara Sanwan. Again, let's stick to the debate. Let's stick to the motion before us, the regulation before us, as we continue along.
Yes. And thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's just one point I would like to rebut again, because it was a point that was repeated, and I think the record cannot go unanswered. And it is the Curup interchange project. You see, the minister didn't bother to tell the House that the scope of works was reduced by this government. And he didn't bother to tell the House how much a certain person was paid for a particular land called Kedona. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I leave that right there. You see, had the member come with a sensible debate, we would have been able to respond to the issues put. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I owe the population an opportunity and a chance now to understand what this Parliament is doing. And we have to look at the objectives of this particular piece of law. And this is a particular piece of law that was passed in the year 2014, and it is Act number 1 of 2015. And if you look at the preamble of this particular piece of legislation, Act 1 of 2015, it reads as follows. It is an act to provide for public procurement and for the retention and disposal of public property in accordance with the principles of good governance, namely accountability, transparency, integrity, and value for money, the establishment of the Office of Procurement Regulation, the repeal of the Central Tenders Board, and related matters. And I put that on record, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because these particular regulations were dragged from the year 2015 when this PNM government took office. They didn't bother, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to have these regulations properly drafted and brought to this Parliament. These regulations were first prepared sometime in 2019. We are now in the year 2022, and we are now debating this. But you see what they did, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is took that intervening period of time to gut the procurement legislation, to gut it. Because while the 2015 Act was very strong in terms of protecting the public purse, in terms of protecting state agencies and ministries from abusing taxpayers' money, what this government's policy via legislation was to gut the procurement legislation. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to focus a little on the regulations that deal with the ineligibility listing. You see, that is in particular a blacklist. So in that piece of regulation, it's number 3 on the order paper, that deals with those persons who would have gone through the particular process and then be placed on an ineligibility list. And if you look at section 58 of the Act, it says that this list means a list of suppliers or contractors who shall not participate in procurement proceedings. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very important matter because of the consequences in which it carries. But when I mentioned earlier that the government has gutted the procurement legislation, we have to read it together with the amendments made. And when you look at Act 27 of 2020, which is an act to amend the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, there are a group or a menu of things that will not fall under the procurement law or the scrutiny of the procurement regulator. And they are as follows. State-controlled enterprises or public bodies in relation to legal services, debt financing services for the national budget, accounting and auditing services, medical emergency or other scheduled medical services, or any such other services as the minister may by order determine. And you see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the problem with that is now that just like the minister said in his piloting of these particular regulations, is that he procured a consultant who falls under one of these exempted services, and that will not be subject to the Procurement Act. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of accounting, auditing, financial services, when, for example, debt financing services for the national budget, that is very wide. And you see, Mr. Deputy Speaker,
one with the greatest of respect, there's a regulation on consultants before us, and this is not a debate on the parent law, on a debate that has passed already with respect to Section 7 of the Act.
Again, member, again, tying your point, I'll give you the opportunity, tying the point as it relates to both the Act and what is before us at present.
The point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that what I'm showing is that these particular exempted services will not fall under the regulation that I'm dealing with in terms of the ineligibility list. So that is the point I was making. So therefore, debt financing services for the national budget, if a particular bank is being favored by this government.
I therefore rise on Standing Order 48.1 because the members just admitted that he's being irrelevant. The regulations have absolutely nothing to do with that because the law disapplies it.
Again, tying your point, member, and then you can move to the other point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the list of individuals or the persons that may fall under an eligibility list are those, for example, who would not follow proper procedure in terms of procurement proceedings, those who may be in terms of fraud, corruption, collusion, or may have been in terms of breaches of this particular Parent Act. Those persons will find themselves having to face the ineligibility list after the entire procedure has been completed. But for example, financial institutions that may have encountered or have been charged with some of these offenses will not, because they are now exempted under the procurement legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Absolutely certain of the irrelevance of the member under 48.1. It is one thing to speak to ineligibility provisions and the regulations, but the debate is not about Section 7 of the Parent Act, which disapplies plainly in law these factors.
Again. In terms, Honorable AG, right, the member has entered the debate, right, and he is making his point relevant in terms of relevance of how he sees it in reference to the act that he's referring to that is in place. So again, proceed, member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You see, it's very difficult to take legal advice from this particular...
Member, I have ruled. Let's proceed. I have ruled.
Okay. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we look again at this particular piece of regulation, I'm looking in particular to the Regulation 3 in terms of the report of prohibited conduct, is that there's a particular procedure that is outlined in the regulations in terms of how reports are to be made. And this is found at 3.1 in terms of a procuring entity, a bidder, a member of the public, if they suspect that a supplier or contractor participates in a contract or a senior officer with respect to prohibited activities under Section 41, 2 or 3 of the Parent Act, he may bring this to the attention of the accounting officer or equivalent in a public body or to the office in a report, together with any documentary evidence at his disposal. And then after this report is made, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what happens is the accounting officer, normally the permanent secretary of the ministry, or could be in terms of the equivalent on a state enterprise, they will now filter this particular report, and that report will be transmitted to the office in terms, the Office of Procurement Regulator, for this particular matter to be determined in terms of whether or not the person should be placed on the ineligibility list. But it triggers, of course, a particular procedure before that can happen. But when you look, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at that particular section that is referred to in the Parent Act, which is Section 41, 2 or 3 of the Act, and deals with complaints. And in this case, it talks about persons may have complaints in terms of bid rigging or collusion or irregularity in procurement proceedings or breach of the Act. They also can write directly to the office. So there are two procedures that flow side by side in terms of this. One is that the person can write to the accounting officer, then the accounting officer makes a decision whether to forward it to the office, or that is under the Regulation 3. But when you look at 41 of the Parent Act, the person can just send the complaint and bypass the accounting officer and go directly to the Office of Procurement Regulator. So there are two streams there, one from the Parent Act, one from the regulation. So there may be a little inconsistency with respect to how the particular complaint is made. Also, in particular, there are a wide range of matters that will, in fact, trip this particular section for a person to be placed under the ineligibility list, such as I said, bid rigging, irregularity in procurement proceedings, breach of the Act. And then when you look at the regulations at 3.7, you see that there's now a definition of something called prohibited conduct. And this is conduct referred to on sections 58.3 or 59.7 of the Parent Act. And I see that is why it's very important to ensure that you read the Parent Act together with the regulations. They cannot be read in isolation, because the regulations supplement, give the teeth to what the Parent Act is saying. The Parent Act gives the power the regulations normally prescribe the procedure in which it is done. So when you look at 58.3, the conduct that the regulations is referring to is those who contractors that consistently fail to provide satisfactory performance, is found to be indulging in corrupt or fraudulent practices, is convicted of an offense under this act. And when you look at 59.7, it deals in particular with a procuring entity where an inducement was offered or any corrupt, fraudulent, collusive, coercive, or obstructive practice was carried out in relation to a tender or proposal. So those are the grounds in which complaints can be made by members of the public in order for a supplier or a contractor to be placed under the ineligibility list. And then when this happens, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a notice is then sent to the supplier or the contractor, because that is part of the natural justice scheme in terms of giving a person a chance to a fair hearing. Now I see it's a notice of proposed ineligibility will be sent to the supplier or contractor. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wonder whether or not that should have been on a prescribed form, because in terms of this particular regulation, it just says a notice will be sent. When you look at, for example, I can give an example of the civil proceedings rules. They are prescribed forms which make things easier. Now, this is an administrative tribunal that will be in fact executing or exercising a judicial function. So you want to ensure that the procedure that is being conducted is a proper one in terms of how the entire process is being worked out, because this is a very important and very coercive piece of regulation in terms of once the person is placed, thank you very much. Once the person is placed on the list, they no longer can participate in public procurement. They cannot tender for contracts. So therefore, you have to also balance that particular issue of constitutional rights. Now, this particular piece of legislation under the former People's Partnership government was in fact passed with a special majority. So it's clothed with constitutional protection. So that is the point with respect to that particular issue in terms of the complaint mechanism and the grounds in which a particular contractor or supplier can in fact be placed on the ineligibility list. Now, there's one thing I would ask the Minister of Finance to note is that in the legislature, when you look at section 58, it deals only with the ineligibility list. So when you read the Parent Act, it seems as though there's only one sanction that can be placed on the contractor. But when you look at the regulations, it expands that list now of ineligibility sanctions at Regulation 7. So the office may impose a formal letter of reprimand based on the respondent's conduct, a conditional non-debarment not exceeding 6 months, or the ineligibility for 1 to 10 years, which in appropriate only in cases of particular egregious offenses and the severity of the offense will determine the period of ineligibility. So I wonder whether or not the regulations are going a little too far, or should have this have been also included in the Parent Act to ensure that we have maximum constitutional protection in terms of the sanctions that can be imposed by the office, in particular with respect to the ineligibility list.
Your time has elapsed.
I thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
At this time, members, the sitting is suspended and we will resume at 5:45. 5:15, sorry. 5:50. 5:15. 5:15.